A single, cryptic letter arrives at Miss Marple's quiet cottage in St. Mary Mead, whispering of a shadow spreading through the coastal town of Seabury. One clue, a rare orchid that doesn't belong, holds the key to unraveling a criminal empire. Who sent the warning? What secrets bloom in a greenhouse guarded by a nervous florist? And why does every step Miss Marple takes draw her closer to a dangerous truth that could shake the foundations of an entire syndicate in a web of smuggling, betrayal, and hidden codes? One elderly spinster's sharp mind might be the only thing standing between justice and chaos. Chapter 1. The curious letter. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a soft, silvery haze. Miss Jane Marple sat in her armchair by the bay window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale lavender shawl. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a warm glow across the room, where shelves of well-worn books and a collection of porcelain teacups spoke of a life quietly observant. Outside, the world was still waking, but Miss Marple's mind was already stirring, alert to the subtle shifts in the village's pulse. She reached for her morning tea, steam curling from the cup, when a sharp rap at the door broke the silence. Her housekeeper, Florence, bustled in, clutching a single envelope. "Post for you, Mum," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Odd one, this no return address." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite her years, flickered with interest. She set her knitting aside and took the envelope, its paper coarse and slightly yellowed, as though it had been stored too long in a forgotten drawer. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink smudged in places, and it bore only her name, Miss J. Marple. No stamp, no postmark, just the letter slipped through her door like a whisper. "Thank you, Florence," she said, her tone mild, but her fingers already tracing the envelope's edges. Florence lingered a moment, hoping for a hint, but Miss Marple's serene smile gave nothing away. With a reluctant nod, Florence retreated to the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple to her mystery. She slid the envelope with the silver letter opener, her movements precise. Inside was a single sheet, folded once, its message brief but arresting. "Dear Miss Marple, you are known for noticing what others miss. In Seabury, by the coast, a shadow grows. Seek the orchid that does not belong in a greenhouse where secrets bloom. Time is short. Trust no one." A friend. Miss Marple read the note twice, her lips pursed. Seabury, a bustling coastal town some 20 miles from St. Mary Mead, was not a place she frequented, but its reputation for lively markets and quaint charm was familiar. An orchid that did not belong? A greenhouse? The vagueness intrigued her as much as it frustrated her. She folded the letter and tucked it into her cardigan pocket, her mind already sifting through possibilities. By noon, she had made her decision. "Florence," she called, stepping into the kitchen where the scent of fresh-baked scones filled the air. "I'm thinking of a little holiday in Seabury. The sea air, you know, does wonders for the constitution." Florence, flour-dusted and skeptical, raised an eyebrow. "A holiday, ma'am? You've not left the village since that business with the vicar's cousin last spring." "What's in Seabury, if I may ask?" "Oh, nothing particular," Miss Marple said airily, adjusting her spectacles. "Just a fancy for a change of scenery." But her eyes gleamed with purpose, and Florence, wise to her employer's ways, merely shook her head and returned to her dough. 2 days later, Miss Marple boarded a rattling bus to Seabury, her suitcase packed with sensible skirts, a few novels, and her knitting. The journey wound through rolling hills, the landscape blurring into a patchwork of green fields and distant cliffs. Seabury greeted her with the tang of salt air and the cries of gulls. The town was larger than St. Mary Mead, its streets lined with colorful shops and fishermen hauling nets along the quay, she checked into the Rose, an anchor, a cozy inn with ivy creeping up its stone walls, and wasted no time in exploring. The market square was a riot of activity. Stalls brimmed with fresh cod, baskets of apples, and bolts of bright fabric. Vendors shouted their wares, their voices mingling with the clatter of carts and the laughter of children darting through the crowd. Miss Marple, in her unassuming tweed coat and straw hat, blended effortlessly, her eyes scanning every detail. She paused at a flower stall, where roses and daisies spilled over wooden crates, tended by a weary man with a weathered face and restless hands. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but probing. "Such lovely blooms. Do you grow them yourself?" The man, whose apron bore the name Harrow's Flowers, glanced up sharply. Most of 'em," he said, his tone clipped. "Greenhouse outback. Family business." His eyes darted to a passerby, then back to her, as if weighing her intent. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "A greenhouse? How marvelous. I've always admired those who can coax such beauty from the earth. Do you ever open it to visitors? I'm something of an amateur gardener myself." Mr. Harrow's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "Not usually. Too much work, you see. But maybe tomorrow, if you're keen. Got a group coming at 10. "Oh, I'd be delighted," she said, her tone so earnest it disarmed him. "I'll be there. Thank you." Mr. Harrow, as she moved on, her basket swinging lightly. She noted the way Harrow's hands fidgeted with a crate, his gaze following her a moment too long. The letter's words echoed in her mind, a greenhouse where secrets bloom. She wandered the market a while longer, buying a small bunch of lavender to maintain her cover. But her thoughts were fixed on the greenhouse. What was Harrow hiding, and who had sent the letter? That evening, she sat in the inn's dining room, a modest space with checkered tablecloths and a view of the harbor. She sipped tea and nibbled at a scone, her notebook open to a page of innocent jottings, weather observations, a sketch of a gull, but her mind was mapping the day. A young waitress, Ellie, refilled her cup, her freckled face bright with chatter. "First time in Seabury, Mum?" Ellie asked, balancing a teapot. "It's lively this time of year, with the market and all, though some say it's got its secrets, too." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though her expression remained placid. "Secrets? Oh, my dear, every town has its stories. What do the locals whisper about?" Ellie leaned in, her voice low. "Well, there's talk about strange goings-on at night. Boats coming in when the harbor's meant to be closed. And that greenhouse of Mr. Harrow's folks say he's got plants in there no one's ever seen. Not that I believe it, mind you." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "How curious. Perhaps I'll see for myself tomorrow. I'm visiting his greenhouse." Ellie's eyes widened. "Are you? Now? Well, mind you don't linger too long. He's not one for prying eyes." She scurried off as another customer called, leaving Miss Marple to ponder. The next morning, Miss Marple arrived at Harrow's Flowers promptly at 10, joining a small group of tourists, mostly retirees, and a young couple snapping photographs. Mr. Harrow greeted them with a practiced smile, but his eyes were wary, lingering on Miss Marple as she adjusted her shawl. The greenhouse was a sprawling structure of glass and iron, its panes fogged with condensation. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and blooms, shelves lined with roses, ferns, and exotic lilies. Harrow led the tour with brisk efficiency, pointing out common plants and rattling off Latin names. Miss Marple listened attentively, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. Then she saw it, a single orchid, its petals of vivid purple streaked with gold, tucked in a corner behind a screen of ferns. It was unlike any she'd seen, its beauty almost unnatural. She stepped closer, feigning admiration. "What a striking orchid," she said, her voice light. "I don't believe I've seen its like before. Is it local?" Harrow's smile faltered. Oh, just a rare breed. Got it from a specialist. Not much to tell." He steered the group away, but Miss Marple lingered, her fingers brushing the leaves. The pot was heavier than it should be, as if weighted with something beneath the soil. The tour ended, and the group dispersed, but Miss Marple dawdled, pretending to admire a begonia. Harrow was distracted, arguing with the delivery man at the greenhouse door. Seizing her chance, she slipped behind a row of shelves, her heart quickening. There, hidden beneath a tarp, was a crate marked with a faint orchid symbol, the same flowers she'd just seen. She lifted the tarp, revealing a stack of ledgers, their pages filled with numbers and coded abbreviations. Footsteps approached, and she froze. Harrow's voice rang out, sharp with irritation. "Oi, who's back there?" Miss Marple straightened, clutching her basket. "Oh, dear me," she said, stepping into view with a flustered smile. "I'm afraid I got turned around. Such a lovely greenhouse, Mr. Harrow. I'll be on my way." His eyes narrowed, but her frail appearance seemed to reassure him. "Mind you don't wander," he muttered, escorting her out back at the Rose and Anchor. Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea glittering under the afternoon sun. She jotted down the ledger's details from memory, dates, numbers, and a recurring word: broker. The orchid, the crate, the ledger, it was all connected, she was sure. The letter had been right. A shadow was growing in Seabury, and she had found her first thread. Tomorrow, she would tug it further. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of coral and violet, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind alight with possibilities. The greenhouse held secrets, and she was determined to unearth them. For now, she had her invitation, her clue, and her wits, and that, she knew, was more than enough. Chapter 2. The greenhouse secreth air in Seabury carried a briny tang, mingling with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, as Miss Jane Marple stepped delicately onto the gravel path leading to Mr. Harrow's greenhouse. The coastal town, with its cobbled streets and salt-weathered cottages, buzzed with the cheerful chaos of market day. But Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the glass structure glinting under the late morning sun. The anonymous letter, now tucked safely in her whereupon cardigan's pocket, had been explicit. A rare orchid held the key to a sinister plot. To an outsider, it might seem fanciful, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss the whispers of intuition. Her holiday in Seabury was no mere whim, it was a mission cloaked in tweed and lavender. Water, the greenhouse, loomed ahead, its panes fogged with condensation, giving it an air of secrecy that piqued her curiosity further. Mr. Harrow, the florist, had been a study in nerves when she'd met him at the market earlier that morning. His hands had trembled as he handed her a bouquet of daisies, and his eyes darted to the greenhouse whenever she mentioned her fondness for rare blooms. Now, as she approached, she adjusted her straw hat, its brim shielding her sharp gaze, and adopted the demeanor of a harmless spinster with a penchant for gardening. It was a role she played effortlessly, one that had disarmed many a suspect in St. Mary Mead. The greenhouse door creaked open, and Mr. Harrow appeared, wiping his hands on a soil-stained apron. He was a weary man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a face etched with worry lines that seemed deeper than the day's labor warranted. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight but polite. "So kind of you to visit. I don't often get such enthusiastic guests." "Oh, Mr. Harrow, you're too modest," Miss Marple replied, her tone light as a summer breeze. "Your reputation for exotic plants precedes you. I simply couldn't resist seeing that orchid I've heard so much about." His smile flickered. like a candle caught in a draft. The orchid, oh, it's just a curiosity, nothing more. Come, let me show you the roses first. They're in full bloom. She followed him inside, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the stone floor. The greenhouse was a jungle of green, with vines curling around iron trellises and pots overflowing with vibrant blooms. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and the faint sweetness of flowers. Miss Marple's eyes swept the space, noting the orderly rows of plants and the locked door at the far end. Half hidden behind a curtain of ivy, Mr. Harrow's chatter about printing techniques was practiced, but his glances toward that door betrayed a restless unease. They reached a small table where the orchid sat, its petals a startling shade of violet, streaked with gold. It was unlike anything Miss Marple had seen, its beauty almost otherworldly, as if it belonged in a fairy tale rather than a seaside greenhouse. My goodness, she murmured, leaning closer. Wherever did you find such a specimen, Mr. Harrow's fingers twitched. A collector brought it from South America. Very rare. Needs precise care. His words were clipped, and he turned away quickly, gesturing toward a cluster of ferns. These are more my pride, though. Let me, South America, you say? Miss Marple interrupted, her voice gentle but probing. How fascinating. One once knew a botanist in St. Mary Mead who tried importing orchids. Such a fuss with customs, wasn't it? Did you have any trouble? His face paled, and he busied himself adjusting a fern's leaves. No trouble. Just a private sale. Nothing official. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. But her mind was racing. The letter had mentioned the orchid as a clue, not a coincidence. She let Mr. Harrow steer her toward the roses, her eyes lingering on the orchid's delicate form. There was something about its placement alone, almost reverently displayed, that felt deliberate, like a signal. But to whom? And for what? As the tour continued, a man entered the greenhouse, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the stone. He was tall, with slicked back hair and a suit that spoke of money and confidence. His eyes, cold and calculating, met Mr. Harrow's, and a silent exchange passed between them. Miss Marple, pretending to admire a geranium, caught every detail. Harrow, the man said, his voice low but commanding. The shipment. Midnight. Don't be late. Mr. Harrow nodded, his hands clenching. Of course, Mr. Crane. Everything's set. Crane. The name struck a chord. Though Miss Marple couldn't yet place it, she filed it away, along with the man's sharp features and the way Harrow's shoulders slumped in his presence. The conversation ended as quickly as it began, and Crane strode out, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne in his wake. Such a busy man, Miss Marple remarked, her tone conversational. A friend of yours, Mr. Harrow. Just a customer, he replied too quickly, his eyes avoiding hers. Buys plants for his estate. Now, shall we see the lilies? She let him change the subject. But her curiosity was now a living thing, coiling tighter with each evasive word. The tour ended soon after, with Mr. Harrow ushering her toward the door, his relief palpable. But Miss Marple had no intention of leaving the greenhouse's secrets behind so easily. Oh, Mr. Harrow, she said, pausing at the threshold. I've left my handkerchief by the ferns. Silly me. May I fetch it? He hesitated, then nodded, his jaw tight. Be quick, please. I've got to lock up. She slipped back inside, her steps slow and deliberate, giving the impression of an absent-minded old lady. But her eyes were sharp, scanning the greenhouse for anything out of place. The locked door at the back beckoned, but she couldn't risk it, not yet. Instead, she moved toward the ferns, her fingers brushing against a shelf where a stack of gardening journals sat. One journal, slightly askew, caught her attention. She lifted it, revealing a slim leather ledger tucked beneath. Her heart quickened. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw Mr. Harrow outside, speaking to a delivery boy. She had moments. At best, she opened the ledger, her eyes darting over the pages. It wasn't a gardening record, it was a meticulous log of transactions, written in a code of numbers and abbreviations. S12, 50K, LDNVC 3/4, the initials VC, appeared repeatedly alongside dates and sums that suggested far more than the sale of flowers. She memorized a few key entries, her mind already piecing together possibilities. Smuggling, blackmail, something larger. The crunch of gravel outside snapped her back to the present. She closed the ledger, replaced the journal, and plucked her handkerchief from the shelf just as Mr. Harrow re-entered. Found it, she called, holding up the lace square with a smile. So careless of me, he nodded, his expression unreadable, and escorted her out. As the greenhouse door clicked shut behind her, Miss Marple felt the weight of her discovery settle in her chest. The orchid, the ledger, the midnight shipment, they were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to unravel. Seabury's quaint facade hid something dark, and she was determined to trace it to its source. Back at her rented cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she thought. The ledger's codes nagged at her, their meaning just out of reach. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a grocer's ledger had hidden gambling debts under innocuous entries. But this felt bigger, more dangerous. Victor Crane's name echoed in her mind, and she wondered about his role. A businessman, a broker, or something more sinister? She set her knitting aside and took out a small notebook, jotting down the memorized entries: S12, 50K, LDNVC 3/4, M7, 20K, BRSTVC 1/2. The abbreviations suggested locations: London, perhaps Bristol. The sums were substantial, far beyond what a florist might handle. And VC, Victor Crane, it was a leap, but one her instincts urged her to consider. The afternoon waned, and Miss Marple decided to return to the market, hoping to glean more about Mr. Harrow and his mysterious visitor. The stalls were still lively, vendors hawking fish, bread, and trinkets under colorful awnings. She paused at a tea stall, where a garrulous woman named Mrs. Tuttle served her a steaming cup. "You're new here, aren't you?" Mrs. Tuttle said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Staying long?" "Just a holiday," Miss Marple replied, sipping her tea. "Though I must say, Seabury's flowers are quite remarkable. Mr. Harrow's greenhouse is a treasure." Mrs. Tuttle's smile faltered. "Harrow keeps to himself, that one, always fussing over his plants. But I reckon there's more to him than meets the eye. Seen some odd folk coming and going from that greenhouse at all hours." "Oh," Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest sharpened. "What sort of folk?" "Fancy types. Mostly men in suits, not the gardening sort. And that Victor Crane always strutting about like he owns the town. They say he's got a grand house up on the cliff, but no one's invited unless they're in his circle." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the gossip. Mrs. Tuttle's chatter confirmed her suspicions. The greenhouse was a hub, and Crane was no mere customer. She finished her tea, thanked the woman, and wandered toward the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed against the pier. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows, and she felt the pull of the midnight hour mentioned in the greenhouse, a shipment, Crane had said. But of what? As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and changed into a darker shawl, one that would blend into the night. She had no intention of missing the midnight rendezvous, but she needed a plan. the docks were. A short walk, and an old lady knitting by the pier would attract little notice. She packed a small basket with her knitting and a thermos of tea, a perfect excuse for lingering in the chilly night air. The docks at midnight were a different world from the bustling market. The air was thick with the smell of seaweed and tar, and the only sounds were the lapping of waves and the creak of moored boats. Miss Marple found a bench near a stack of crates, her needles clicking softly as she settled into her role as an unremarkable onlooker. The moonlight glinted off the water, and she kept her eyes on the horizon, where a small boat might appear at precisely midnight. A low hum broke the silence, a motorboat approaching the dock. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her needles moving, her face half hidden by her shawl. A group of men emerged from the shadows, Mr. Harrow among them, his nervous energy palpable even from a distance. The boat docked, and sailors began unloading crates, each marked with a faint orchid symbol. Miss Marple's breath caught. There it was again, the orchid, tying the greenhouse to this clandestine operation. A young man, no older than 20, fumbled with one of the crates, and it slipped from his grasp, splitting open on the dock. A cascade of glittering jewels spilled out, catching the moonlight. The boy Tom, she later learned, froze, his face pale with fear. "Careful, you idiot," one of the sailors hissed, shoving him aside. Harrow rushed over, his voice low but urgent. "Get it cleaned up. Now?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. Smuggled jewels, hidden in crates marked with an orchid. The ledger's codes flashed in her memory, shipments, sums, initials. This was no small-time operation. The fear in Tom's eyes told her he was no willing participant, and she resolved to speak with him. An unwilling accomplice could be a valuable ally. As the men finished unloading, Miss Marple slipped away, her basket tucked under her arm. She had seen enough to confirm the letter's warning, but she needed more names, motives, the full scope of the plot. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and opened her notebook, adding new details: the orchid symbol, the jewels, Tom's fear, and Victor Crane's commanding presence. The greenhouse was no mere front, it was the heart of something far-reaching, and she was determined to expose it. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the docks. This time under the guise of buying fresh fish. She spotted Tom unloading crates, his movements sluggish, his eyes darting nervously. She approached with a warm smile, offering a coin for a small bundle of cod. "You work so hard, young man," she said kindly. "Must be tiring, out here all hours." Tom glanced up, wary but softened by her gentle tone. "It's just work, ma'am. I imagine it's not always easy," she continued, her voice low, especially with such important deliveries. "You must see all sorts of things." His hands stilled, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. But something in her steady gaze held him. "I don't know nothing," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of desperation. Miss Marple leaned closer, her tone conspiratorial. "If you ever need a friend to talk to, I'm staying at Rose Cottage. I've a knack for listening, you know." Tom nodded, his expression torn, and she left him to his work, confident she had planted a seed. The greenhouse, the ledger, the jewels, and now Tom, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was beginning to see its shape. As she walked back to her cottage, the sea breeze tugging at her hat, she felt a quiet thrill. The orchid was more than a clue, it was a beacon, guiding her deeper into Seabury's shadows. Chapter 3. The midnight dock. Moon hung low over Seabury, a silver crescent casting a fragile glow across the coastal town's jagged cliffs and restless waves. The air was thick with the briny tang of the sea, and a faint mist curled around the cobblestone streets, muffling the distant clatter of late-night carts. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a woolen shawl and clutching a knitting bag that held no yarn, stood at the edge of the pier, her silhouette blending into the shadows of a weathered lamppost. To any passerby, she was merely an elderly woman, perhaps, lost in nostalgia for quieter nights, her needles clicking softly as she worked on an imaginary scarf. But her sharp eyes, hidden behind the glint of her spectacles, were fixed on the dock below, where the tide lapped greedily at the hulls of moored boats. Seabury's dock was a place of secrets. Miss Marple had decided. The anonymous letter she'd received at her cottage in St. Mary Mead had been cryptic but precise, pointing her to this coastal town and a single, curious clue. A rare orchid housed in Mr. Harrow's greenhouse. Her visit to the greenhouse earlier that day had confirmed her suspicions. Something was amiss in Seabury, and the nervous florist was at the heart of it. The ledger she glimpsed, filled with coded transactions, had only deepened the mystery. Now, under the cover of midnight, she was here to witness the shipment Harrow had mentioned in his hushed conversation with a sharply dressed stranger. The dock was alive with subtle sounds, the creak of ropes straining against moorings, the faint splash of fish breaking the surface, and the low murmur of voices carried on the breeze. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing the small notebook tucked into her bag, ready to jot down anything of note. She had chosen her vantage point carefully, a rickety bench near a pile of lobster traps. Close enough to observe, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Her knitting needles moved rhythmically, a perfect disguise for her true purpose, to watch, to listen, and to piece together the puzzle. Below, a fishing trawler bobbed gently, its deck illuminated by a single lantern swaying in the wind. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their boots thudding softly on the wooden planks. One was Mr. Harrow, his weary frame unmistakable even in the dim light, his movements jerky with nervous energy. The other was a burly man in a sailor's cap, his face obscured by a scarf pulled high against the chill. They spoke in low tones, their words fragmented by the wind, but sharp enough for Miss Marple's keen ears to catch. Late again, Harrow muttered, glancing at his pocket watch. The broker won't like this. Calm yourself, Harrow, the sailor replied, his voice a gravelly rumble. The cargo's here. Just keep your head down and your mouth shut. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. The broker? The name sent a ripple of intrigue through her. It was the first concrete hint of a larger force at play. Someone orchestrating whatever scheme was unfolding in Seabury. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as a third figure appeared, a young man, no older than 20, with tousled hair and a nervous gait. He carried a crate, staggering under its weight, and set it down with a thud that echoed across the dock. Careful, Tom, Harrow hissed, darting forward. You want to wake the whole town. Sorry, Mr. Harrow. The young man stammered, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool night air. It's heavier than the last one. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. On the boy Tom, she presumed. His hands trembled as he adjusted the crate, and his eyes flicked toward the shadows as if expecting something or someone to emerge. There was fear in his posture, the kind that came from being caught in something far bigger than himself. She made a mental note of his name and appearance, lanky, with a mop of dark hair and a face that still held the softness of youth, now etched with worry. The sailor stepped forward, prying open the crate with a crowbar. The wood splintered, and Miss Marple strained to see as he lifted the lid. The lantern's light caught a glint of something inside something that sparkled with an unnatural brilliance. Jewels. Rubies, emeralds, and sapphires, nestled in velvet like stars plucked from the sky. Her breath caught, not at the beauty of the gems, but at the implications. Smuggling. Seabury, with its quiet charm and sleepy streets, Was a front for an operation far more sinister than she'd imagined? Tom backed away from the crate, his hands twisting together. I didn't sign up for this, he muttered, almost to himself. You said it was just flowers. Harrow rounded on him, his voice low and venomous. Keep your voice down, boy. You're in too deep to back out now. The broker doesn't take kindly to loose ends. The sailor chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. He's right, lad. You'd best learn to hold your tongue, or you'll find it cut out. Tom's face paled, and he took another step back, nearly tripping over a coil of rope. Miss Marple's heart ached for the boy, trapped in a web he hadn't spun. She recognized the signs of coercion. The hunched shoulders, the darting eyes, the way he flinched at Harrow's words. Whoever this broker was, they held power over Tom, and likely others in Seabury. The exchange continued, with Harrow and the sailor inspecting the crate and muttering about schedules and payments. Miss Marple jotted down fragments of their conversation in her notebook, her handwriting steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Orchid symbol on crate. Midnight delivery. The broker. Jewels, not flowers. Each detail was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving, one that would soon reveal the full picture. As the men sealed the crate and began moving it toward a nearby warehouse, a sudden noise broke the rhythm of the night, a sharp clatter, like metal striking stone. The trio froze, and Miss Marple's needles stilled. A cat, perhaps, or a loose plank shifting in the wind. But the men's reactions told her otherwise. Harrow's hand went to his pocket, where the outline of a small pistol was visible, and the sailor scanned the darkness with narrowed eyes. Who's there? Harrow called, his voice sharp with panic. Miss Marple held her breath, her body perfectly still. She was hidden in the shadows, but a single misstep could betray her. The sailor took a step toward her bench, his boots heavy on the dock. Her mind raced, calculating her options. She could feign sleep, but that might invite closer inspection. She could slip away, but the creaking boards would give her away. Instead, she did what she did best. She became invisible. Oh, dear me, she said softly, her voice quavering with the perfect pitch of an elderly woman startled from her thoughts. Is someone there? I must have dozed off while knitting. The sailor stopped, his suspicion wavering as he took in the sight of her, a frail figure wrapped in a shawl, her needles glinting in the moonlight. Just an old lady, he muttered to Harrow, waving a hand dismissively. Go back to your knitting, ma'am. This ain't no place for you at this hour. Oh, goodness, I quite lost track of time, Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic. The sea air is so soothing, you know. I'll be on my way. She gathered her bag slowly, giving the men time to lose interest. Harrow, still jittery, turned back to the crate, muttering something about nosy old bats. The sailor grunted and resumed his work, and Tom, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, seemed to relax slightly. Miss Marple shuffled away from the bench, her steps deliberate and unhurried, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The jewels, the orchid symbol, the broker's name, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that stretched beyond Seabury's sleepy shores. But it was Tom who lingered in her thoughts. His fear, his reluctance, his muttered protest about just flowers. He was no hardened criminal. He was a pawn, and Miss Marple had always had a soft spot for those caught in others' games. The next morning, Seabury was bathed in sunlight, the dock bustling with fishermen unloading their catches, and vendors hawking their wares. Miss Marple, now dressed in a sensible tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan, wandered through the market, her eyes scanning for Tom. She found him near a fishmonger's stall, hauling crates of cod with the same nervous energy she'd seen the night before. Good morning, young man, she said brightly, pausing by the stall as if inspecting the fish. You look awfully busy. Do they work you hard here? Tom started, nearly dropping a crate. Yes. Ma'am, he said, his voice hesitant. Just doing my job. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. Oh, I know how it is. My nephew Raymond used to work on the docks in his youth. Such a demanding job. And not always appreciated, is it? Tom's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he managed a small smile. No, ma'am. Not always. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You seem a bit tired, dear. Long nights. Perhaps his smile faltered, and his eyes darted to the side, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Just work, ma'am. Keeps me up late sometimes. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic. I understand, but if you ever need a friendly ear, I'm staying at the Rose Cottage Inn. I have a knack for listening, and I've seen a thing or two in my time. Tom hesitated, his fingers tightening around the crate. For a moment, she thought he might brush her off, but something in her gentle demeanor seemed to reach him. Thanks, ma'am, he said softly. I'll keep that in mind. Over the next few days, Miss Marple made a point of crossing paths with Tom. She bought fish from the stall where he worked, complimented his diligence, and shared harmless anecdotes about St. Mary Mead. Each encounter chipped away at his wariness, and by the third day, he began to open up. He spoke of his widowed mother, who relied on his wages, and his dreams of leaving Seabury to become a mechanic. But there was always a shadow in his words, a hesitation when the conversation turned to his late-night work. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the market began to quiet, Miss Marple found Tom sitting alone on a crate by the dock, staring out at the sea. She approached quietly, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Mind if I join you? She asked, settling onto a nearby crate without waiting for an answer. It's a lovely view, isn't it? Tom nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Yeah, makes you forget things for a bit. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to knit, though her attention was entirely on the boy. Things weighing on you, Tom? He was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the crate. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to get mixed up in it, ma'am. They said it was just moving flowers, helping Mr. Harrow with deliveries. But it's not flowers. It's bad stuff. And now I can't get out. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm. Who's keeping you in, dear? Tom's eyes flicked toward her, then away. They call him the broker. I don't even know his real name, but Mr. Harrow works for him, and he's not someone you say no to. She nodded, as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. And what do they have you do, Tom? He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. Moving crates, like last night. They're full of things, jewels, sometimes papers. They go to the greenhouse first, then somewhere else. I don't know where. But if I stop, they'll hurt my mum. They said so. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The greenhouse was indeed a front, as she'd suspected. But the scope of the operation was larger than she'd imagined. Jewels, papers, a mysterious figure pulling the strings. This was no small-time smuggling ring. And Tom, poor Tom, was caught in the middle. You're very brave to tell me this, she said gently. It's not easy to speak of such things. Tom shook his head, his voice bitter. I'm not brave. I'm scared all the time. But you seem like you understand. I do, Miss Marple said, her tone firm but kind. And I think you're stronger than you know. If you trust me, Tom, I might be able to help you. He looked at her then, his eyes searching her face for any hint of deceit. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "What do I do, ma'am?" "For now, just keep doing what you're doing," she said. "Don't let them suspect anything. But if you hear anything about the broker, where he might be, or what he's planning, come to me. I'll be at the inn." Tom nodded again, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said with a smile. Jane Marple. As she walked back to the Rose Cottage Inn, the weight of Tom's confession settled over her. The orchid, the jewels, the ledger, the broker, it was all connected. And the threads were leading her toward a man named Victor Crane, a local businessman whose name had surfaced in hushed conversations around town. His pristine reputation and lavish estate were at odds with the darkness Tom had described. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous wolves often wore the finest wool. She sat by her window that night, her knitting abandoned as she jotted down her thoughts in her notebook. The dog, the crate, the orchid symbol, they were all pieces of a larger machine, one that operated in the shadows of Seabury's charm. And Tom, with his reluctant honesty, had given her away in. She would need to tread carefully, but Miss Marple had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The next day, she learned of a charity gala at Crane's mansion, an event attended by Seabury's elite. It was the perfect opportunity to observe the man himself, to see if the threads of her investigation led to his door. With a quiet determination, she set about securing an invitation, her mind already weaving a plan to unravel the mystery of the broker and his empire one clue at a time. Chapter 4. Tom's Talith. Salty breeze of Seabury's coastline carried a faint tang of seaweed and tar as Miss Jane Marple sat on a weathered bench overlooking the harbor. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as the lapping waves below, but her sharp eyes were fixed on the young dockworker, Tom, who shuffled nervously near a stack of crates. The moonlight glinted off the water, casting long shadows that danced across the pier, and Miss Marple's mind was as active as ever, piecing together the puzzle that had begun with a single clue. A rare orchid. Tom had been an unexpected ally. His frightened expression when the crate of smuggled jewels had spilled open the previous night had caught her attention, not for its guilt, but for its raw, unguarded fear. He was no hardened criminal. That much was clear. He was a lad caught in something far bigger than himself, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing the good in people, had sensed an opportunity. She'd approached him after the midnight dock exchange, her voice gentle but firm, offering a kind word and a cup of tea at the small cafe near the pier. Tom, wary but desperate, had agreed. Now, in the soft glow of the cafe's oil lamps, Miss Marple sat across from him, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag. The cafe was a modest affair, with checkered tablecloths and chipped teacups, its walls adorned with faded photographs of Seabury's fishing glory days. The air smelled of strong coffee and freshly baked scones, and the hum of conversation from a few late-night patrons provided a comforting backdrop. Tom, however, looked anything but comforted. His hands fidgeted with the handle of his mug, and his eyes darted toward the door every few seconds, as if expecting trouble to barge in. "Tom, dear," Miss Marple began, her voice soft as a lullaby, "you've nothing to fear from me. I'm just an old lady who's curious about the goings-on in this charming town. But I can see you're troubled. Perhaps you'd feel better if you shared what's weighing on you." Tom's shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his sandy hair, leaving it more disheveled than before. "You don't understand, miss. It's not just trouble. It's dangerous. People like me, we don't get out of things like this." Miss Marple tilted her head, her pale blue eyes glinting with quiet understanding. "Oh, I think you'd be surprised, Tom. I've Known many a young man in a pickle who found his way out with a bit of help. Why don't you start at the beginning? Tell me about this broker you mentioned last night. Tom froze, his knuckles whitening around the mug. For a moment, she thought he might bolt, but then he exhaled a long, shuddering breath and began to speak. It started a year ago. I was out of work, my mom was sick, and the bills were piling up. I took odd jobs at the dock, loading cargo, cleaning boats, that sort of thing. One night, this man Harrow, the florist, came up to me, said he had a job that paid better than hauling fish crates. All I had to do was keep my mouth shut and move some boxes from his greenhouse to the dock. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle encouragement. She'd heard stories like this before, young people drawn into schemes by the promise of quick money, only to find themselves trapped. And these boxes, she said, they weren't filled with flowers, were they? Tom shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. No, ma'am. At first, I didn't know what was in them. They were heavy, sealed tight, marked with this orchid symbol. I thought maybe it was just fancy plants or something. But then one night a crate split open, and I saw what was inside. Jewels, gold, even some old coins. Things that didn't belong in a florist's shop. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, though her face remained calm. And Mr. Harrow, he's not just a florist, is he? Tom's eyes widened, and he leaned closer, his voice barely audible. He's working for someone they call the broker. I've never seen him, but Harrow's scared of him. Everyone is. The broker runs everything, shipments, payoffs, even. The coppers turn a blind eye. They say he's got eyes all over Seabury. And if you cross him, you don't just lose your job, you disappear. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for a moment, her mind turning over this new piece of information. The broker, a shadowy figure pulling strings from behind the scenes, using fear to keep his operatives in line. It was a classic setup, one she'd seen in smaller forms in the villages of her youth. Gossip networks, petty blackmail, power wielded through whispers. But this was on a grander scale, and the rare orchid was the thread tying it all together. Did you ever hear a name, Tom? She asked, her tone light but probing. Someone the broker answers to, perhaps. Or someone who gives Harrow his orders? Tom hesitated, glancing around the cafe again. The other patrons, a grizzled fisherman and a pair of giggling girls, paid them no mind, but he still seemed spooked. There's one name I've heard, he said finally. Victor Crane. He's a big shot round here, owns half the town, runs a shipping company, throws fancy parties, acts like he's king of Seabury. But I've seen Harrow meeting with him late at night at the greenhouse. And once, when I was loading crates, I heard Harrow muttering about Crane being the one who calls the shots. Miss Marple's heart gave a small leap, though her face betrayed nothing. Victor Crane. The name rang a bell, not from Seabury, but from a snippet of gossip she'd overheard at the market, about a charming businessman whose wealth seemed to grow faster than his shipping empire could explain. She'd seen his name in the ledger she'd glimpsed in the greenhouse, too, though it had been buried in coded shorthand. Now, it seemed, the pieces were starting to fit. Victor Crane, she mused aloud, as if the name were merely interesting. He sounds like quite a figure. Tell me, Tom, does he ever come to the dock himself? Or is it always Mr. Harrow handling the shipments? Crane doesn't get his hands dirty, Tom said bitterly. He stays up in his big house on the hill, throwing galas and shaking hands with politicians. Harrow does the grunt work, and people like me get stuck carrying the crates. But I heard Crane's hosting a charity gala tomorrow night. Everyone who's anyone in Seabury will be there. if you want to know more about him, that's where you'd see him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. A gala. A perfect opportunity to observe Victor Crane in his element, surrounded by the town's elite, where secrets often slipped out in the glow of champagne and candlelight. She'd attended many such events in her younger days, blending into the background while overhearing conversations that would make a vicar blush. But she'd need an invitation, and those weren't handed out to just anyone. "Thank you, Tom," she said warmly, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "You've been ever so helpful. And don't you worry, I've a way of keeping secrets myself. We'll sort this out." "You and I," Tom managed a weak smile, though his eyes were still haunted. "I hope so, miss, but be careful. If Crane or the broker find out you're poking around." "Oh, I'm just a harmless old spinster, miss," Marple said with a chuckle, though her mind was already racing ahead. "Who would suspect me of anything?" The next morning, Seabury buzzed with preparations for Victor Crane's charity gala. The town square was alive with vendors selling flowers and ribbons, and the local seamstress was swamped with orders for last-minute gown alterations. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual sensible tweed and a modest hat adorned with a single feather, strolled through the market, her keen eyes taking in every detail. She stopped at a stall selling homemade jams, striking up a conversation with the vendor, a chatty woman named Mrs. Phipps. "Such a to-do about this gala," Miss Marple remarked, examining a jar of blackberry preserve. "I suppose Mr. Crane's event is the talk of the town." "Oh, indeed," Mrs. Phipps said, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Everyone's clamoring for an invitation. They say the ballroom at Crane's estate is like something out of a fairy tale. Chandeliers, marble floors, and a string quartet flown in from London, all to raise money for the orphanage, of course. Mr. Crane's ever so generous." Miss Marple smiled, her mind noting the word generous and filing it away for later scrutiny. "It sounds lovely," she said. "I don't suppose an old lady like me could hope for an invitation, though. I'm only visiting Seabury for a short holiday." Mrs. Phipps leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, between you and me, I heard Mr. Crane's secretary misplaced a few invitations. One of the maids at the big house found one in the rubbish bin, if you can believe it. She's my cousin's girl, and she said she'd give it to someone who'd appreciate it. You seem like a nice sort. Shall I put in a word?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with gratitude. "That would be terribly kind of you, Mrs. Phipps. I'd love to see such a grand event, even if I'm only watching from the sidelines. By noon, thanks to Mrs. Phipps' cousin's girl." Miss Marple held a crisp, gold-embossed invitation in her hands. It was addressed to a Miss Eleanor Price, a name she assumed belonged to some forgotten guest who'd never claim it. She tucked the invitation into her handbag, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect of stepping into Victor Crane's world. That evening, Miss Marple stood before the mirror in her modest room at the Seabury Inn, adjusting her attire. She'd chosen a simple but elegant dress of deep navy, its high neck and long sleeves lending her an air of understated dignity. A cameo brooch, a gift from her nephew Raymond, adorned her collar, and she'd borrowed a lace shawl from the innkeeper's wife to add a touch of sophistication. Her gray hair was neatly pinned, and her spectacles gleamed, giving her the appearance of a kindly aunt who'd wandered into the wrong party. Perfect. The drive to Crane's estate was a short one, the taxi winding up a hill lined with ancient oaks. The mansion loomed into view, its stone facade glowing under the light of dozens of lanterns. Carriages and motor cars lined the gravel drive, and guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits spilled out onto the lawn, their laughter mingling with the strains of a violin. Miss Marple handed her invitation to a stern-faced butler, who barely glanced at it before waving her inside. The ballroom was every bit as grand as Mrs. Phipps had described. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished marble floor, and long tables groaned under the weight of silver platters laden with delicacies. A string quartet played a lively waltz, and couples swirled across the dance floor, their faces flushed with wine and merriment. Miss Marple, however, was not here for the canapes or the music. She moved quietly through the crowd, her small frame blending seamlessly with the older matrons and wallflowers who hovered at the edges of the room. Victor Crane was easy to spot. He stood near the center of the ballroom, a tall man in his 40s, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that was both charming and calculated. His tailored suit was impeccable, and a gold watch chain gleamed at his waist. He was surrounded by a cluster of admirers, including a portly mayor and a simpering debutante, all hanging on his every word. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes scanned the room, not with the relaxed confidence of a host, but with the sharp vigilance of a man who expected trouble. She sipped a glass of lemonade, her gaze drifting to a woman standing near Crane. She was striking, with auburn hair piled high and an emerald green gown that caught the light. Her expression was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line as she exchanged words with Crane. Their conversation was brief but heated, and Miss Marple caught the word dead before the woman turned away, her face pale. Intrigued, Miss Marple edged closer, pretending to admire a vase of roses near the refreshment table. The woman, who a passing guest addressed as Lydia, moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, her hands twisting nervously at her sides. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her steps light and unhurried. When Lydia paused near a set of French doors leading to a balcony, Miss Marple seized her chance. She approached, her voice warm and disarming. "Such a lovely evening, isn't it?" she said, gesturing to the starry sky beyond the doors. "I'm afraid I'm not much for dancing, but I do enjoy a bit of fresh air. Are you enjoying the gala, my dear?" Lydia started, her eyes narrowing for a moment before softening. "Oh, yes. It's quite something," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "I just needed a moment away from the crowd." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "These events can be overwhelming. I couldn't help but notice your lovely dress and that orchid pinned to it. It's quite unusual, isn't it? I saw one just like it in Mr. Harrow's greenhouse the other day." Lydia's hand flew to the orchid, her fingers brushing the delicate petals. For a moment, she looked as if she might faint, but she recovered quickly, forcing a smile. "Oh, this. Just a little keepsake. I'm fond of flowers." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "It's remarkable how such a small thing can catch the eye. Almost like a signal, wouldn't you say?" Lydia's smile faltered, and her eyes darted toward the ballroom, where Crane was now laughing with a group of businessmen. I should get back," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "My dear, I don't mean to pry, but you seem troubled. If there's something weighing on you, I'm a very good listener, and I'm rather good at keeping secrets, too." Lydia hesitated, her gaze locked on Miss Marple's kind, unassuming face. For a moment, the noise of the gala seemed to fade, and the two women stood in a bubble of silence. Then Lydia's shoulders sagged, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Not here," she whispered. "There's a tea room in town, the Rose and Crown. Meet me there tomorrow at noon. I need to tell someone." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene. "Of course, my dear. I'll be there." As Lydia slipped back into the crowd, Miss Marple lingered by the balcony, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The orchid, the ledger, Tom's fear, Crane's charm, Lydia's tension, it was all connected, and the threads were beginning to form a pattern. She glanced at the orchid on Lydia's dress, its petals glowing faintly in the moonlight, and knew it was more than a decoration. It was a symbol, a mark of something far darker. With a satisfied smile, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and returned to the ballroom. She had secured her next lead, and tomorrow's meeting with Lydia promised to unravel another layer of the mystery. As she nibbled on a petit four and watched Victor Crane charm his guests, she felt a quiet thrill. The game was afoot, and Miss Jane Marple was exactly where she needed to be. Chapter 5. The gala's Facadeth evening air in Seabury carried a crisp edge, laced with the faint tang of salt from the nearby coast. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a modest yet elegant gown of dove-gray silk, stepped from the hired car onto the gravel drive of Victor Crane's sprawling estate. The mansion loomed before her, its Palladian facade aglow with golden light spilling from tall windows. Ivy clung to the stonework, softening the grandeur with a touch of timeless charm. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw beyond the opulence. Somewhere within those walls, she suspected, lay the heart of a criminal enterprise, one that had begun with a single curious clue, a rare orchid. The charity gala was the event of the season in Seabury, a glittering affair that drew the town's elite like moths to a flame. Miss Marple had secured her invitation through a well-placed compliment to the vicar's wife, who had connections to Crane's social circle. As she ascended the marble steps, her black lace shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, she adopted the air of a kindly, unassuming spinster, her most effective disguise. The doorman, a young man with a stiff collar and a nervous smile, barely glanced at her as he waved her through. To him, she was just another elderly guest, here to sip champagne and admire the roses. How little he knew. Inside, the grand ballroom was a whirl of color and sound. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic glints across the polished parquet floor, where couples swayed to a string quartet's rendition of a Viennese waltz. Ladies in jewel-toned gowns laughed brightly, their voices mingling with the clink of glasses and the low hum of self-important conversation. Gentlemen in tailored evening suits moved with practiced ease, their smiles as polished as their cufflinks. Miss Marple paused near a towering arrangement of lilies, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet precision of a hawk. She noted the faces, the gestures, the fleeting glances that betrayed more than words ever could. Victor Crane stood at the center of it all, a man who wore his charm like a second skin. He was tall, with silver-flecked hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled a smile that never quite reached his soul. Miss Marple thought he was surrounded by a cluster of admirers, his deep laugh cutting through the music as he recounted an anecdote about a recent trip to Monte Carlo. She observed the way people leaned toward him, drawn by his magnetism, yet she sensed an undercurrent of deference, perhaps even fear, in their postures. Crane was not just a man. He was a force, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing waiter, her fingers brushing the crystal as she murmured a polite thank you. Sipping slowly, she drifted toward a quieter corner of the room, where a group of matrons discussed the local hospital's funding drive, the ostensible purpose of the gala. Their chatter was predictable, full of petty rivalries and veiled boasts. But Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her attention elsewhere. She was searching for the woman named Lydia, whose name had surfaced in her inquiries about Crane. The florist, Mr. Harrow, had mentioned her in passing during the greenhouse tour, and Tom, the frightened dockworker, had hinted at a connection to Crane's operations. If Lydia was here, she might hold the next piece of the puzzle. As the quartet shifted to a slower, more melancholic tune, Miss Marple's gaze landed on a woman standing alone near a set of French doors that opened onto a terrace. She was striking, with auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon and a gown of deep emerald that shimmered under the chandelier light. Pinned to her bodice was a single flower, a rare orchid, its petals a delicate shade of violet with veins of gold. It was identical to the one Miss Marple had seen in Harrow's greenhouse, and her heart quickened. This was no coincidence. The woman, whom Miss Marple deduced must be Lydia, held a champagne flute, but did not drink from it. Her eyes darted across the room, lingering on Crane before flitting away. There was a tension in her posture, a brittleness, that suggested she was here not for pleasure, but for some unspoken purpose. Miss Marple set her lemonade on a nearby table and began to move, her steps slow and deliberate, as if admiring the floral arrangements that lined the room. She wove through the crowd, pausing to exchange pleasantries with a retired colonel who rambled about his rose garden, all the while keeping Lydia in her peripheral vision. As she drew closer, Miss Marple overheard a snippet of conversation from a nearby group. A stout man in a velvet waistcoat was speaking in hushed tones to a woman with a peacock feather fan. Crane's got the whole town in his pocket, he muttered. Even the mayor's here, fawning over him. But mark my words, there's something rotten under all this polish. The woman shushed him, glancing nervously toward Crane. But Miss Marple tucked the comment away. Seabury's elite might admire Crane, but not all were blind to his shadow. She reached the French doors just as Lydia stepped onto the terrace, perhaps seeking a moment of solitude. Miss Marple followed, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The terrace was bathed in moonlight, the air cool and scented with jasmine from the gardens below. Lydia stood at the balustrade, her hands gripping the stone as if anchoring herself against a storm. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, and Lydia turned, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Good evening, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and disarming. "I couldn't help but admire your orchid. Such a rare bloom, quite out of the ordinary for a gala, wouldn't you say?" Lydia's fingers brushed the flower, and for a moment, her guard seemed to falter. "It's a gift," she said carefully, "from a friend." "A very particular friend, I imagine," Miss Marple replied, her tone light, but her eyes keen. "I saw one just like it in Mr. Harrow's greenhouse. He spoke so fondly of his collection." Lydia's lips parted, but no words came. She glanced back toward the ballroom, where Crane's laughter rang out again, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of fear in her eyes. This was no time to press too hard, she decided. Instead, she shifted tactics, adopting the air of a gossipy aunt. "These galas are such a whirl, aren't they? All this glamour. But one does wonder what goes on behind the scenes. I heard the most curious thing about something about Mr. Crane. Perhaps the mention of Crane's name was like a spark to dry tinder." Lydia's face paled, and she took a step back, her hand tightening on her glass. "You've heard wrong," she said, her voice sharp. "There's nothing to know about Victor. He's a generous man, nothing more." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly, though her mind was racing. "But you know how tongues wag in small towns. I only mention it because you seem troubled. If there's anything you'd like to share, I'm quite discreet." Lydia hesitated, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. For a moment, it seemed she might speak, but then a shadow fell across the terrace. Miss Marple turned to see Victor Crane himself approaching, his smile as polished as ever, but his eyes cold and assessing. "Lydia, my dear, you're missing the dancing," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. He barely glanced at Miss Marple, but she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "And who is your charming companion?" "Miss Marple." She introduced herself, extending a gloved hand. "Just a visitor to Seabury. Enjoying your lovely gala. You've outdone yourself, Mr. Crane." He took her hand briefly, his grip firm but fleeting. "You're too kind, Miss Marple. I hope you're finding our little town to your liking." "Oh, immensely," she replied, her smile unwavering. "There's so much to discover here. Such unexpected treasures." Crane's smile tightened, but he inclined his head. "Do enjoy the evening. Lydia, shall we?" He offered his arm, and Lydia took it with a reluctance Miss Marple did not miss. As they returned to the ballroom, she caught the faintest tremble in Lydia's hand. Left alone on the terrace, Miss Marple considered her next move. Lydia was clearly entangled with Crane, and the orchid was no mere decoration, it was a signal, a marker of some kind. But what? And why was Lydia so afraid? The answer, she suspected, lay in that whispered word, debt. She needed to speak to Lydia alone, away from Crane's watchful eyes. The ballroom was growing warmer, the air thick with perfume and the buzz of conversation. Miss Marple re-entered, her eyes scanning for an opportunity. She spotted Lydia near the dessert table, now separated from Crane, who was engrossed in conversation with the mayor. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple approached, her expression one of kindly concern. "My dear, you dropped this," she said, holding out a folded piece of paper she had discreetly prepared. It was blank save for a brief note. "Meet me at the tea room on High Street tomorrow. 2 p.m. I can help. -J.M. Lydia single quotes S eyes widened as she took the note, her fingers brushing Miss Marple's. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered, tucking the note into her reticule. Miss Marple smiled, her heart lifting. "Enjoy the gala, my dear. It's such a splendid evening." As Lydia moved away, Miss Marple retreated to a corner, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The orchid, the debt, Crane's untouchable orchid all pointed to a web far larger than Seabury. But webs, she knew, could be unraveled with a single, well-placed tug. Tomorrow's meeting with Lydia would be her next step, and she would be ready. The quartet struck up a lively polka, and the room erupted in laughter and movement. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her eyes twinkling with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who knew she was one step closer to toppling an empire. Chapter 6. Lydia's confession. Tea room in Seabury was a quaint establishment, tucked away on a cobbled side street where ivy clung to the stone walls, like an old friend's embrace. Its windows, framed with lace curtains, glowed softly in the late afternoon light, casting a warm, honeyed hue over the mismatched tables and chairs. The air inside carried the comforting scent of chamomile and freshly baked scones, mingling with the faint tang of sea salt that seemed to permeate every corner of the coastal town. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her usual tweed skirt and a modest cardigan, sat at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue scarf. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying a quiet tea, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the nervous fidgeting of the waitress, nor the way the door creaked open to admit Lydia Harrow, her face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Lydia hesitated at the threshold, her gloved hands clutching a small handbag as if it were a lifeline. Her eyes darted around the room, searching until they landed on Miss Marple. With a small nod, she crossed the tea room, her heels clicking against the polished wooden floor. She slid into the chair opposite Miss Marple, her movements precise, but betraying a tremor of anxiety. "You're punctual, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and disarming, as if they were old friends meeting for a gossip. "I do appreciate that. Would you care for some tea?" The chamomile is quite soothing. Lydia's lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Miss Marple. But I'm not here for pleasantries. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, and she leaned forward slightly, her hat casting a shadow over her pale features. You said you knew something. About Victor. About everything. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I said I wished to speak with you, dear, and I believe you have something to tell me. Something that's been weighing on you for quite some time. Lydia's fingers tightened around her handbag, the leather creaking under the pressure. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of bolting, but then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. You're not like the others in this town, she said, her voice barely audible. They see Victor and think he's some kind of saint, a businessman, a philanthropist. But you see things, don't you? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a gentle knowing. I've always found that people are rather like my knitting patterns, my dear. At first glance, they seem straightforward, but if you look closely, you'll find the odd dropped stitch or tangled thread that tells a different story. Lydia's gaze dropped to the table, where a delicate teacup sat untouched. I don't know where to begin, she admitted, her voice cracking. It's all so twisted. Begin where it feels right, Miss Marple said softly. I find the truth often unravels itself if you give it a little tug. The tea room was quiet, save for the faint clink of porcelain from a nearby table and the distant hum of conversation. Lydia took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for a plunge into cold water. Victor Crane is my brother, she said finally, the words tumbling out like stones dislodged from a dam. My older brother, though you'd never know it from the way he acts. He's always been ambitious, ruthless even, but I never thought he'd go this far. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity, though her mind was already piecing together fragments from the past few days. The rare orchid in Harrow's greenhouse, the cryptic ledger, the smuggled jewels at the dock. This far, my dear. Do you mean his business dealings? Lydia's laugh was bitter, sharp enough to cut through the tea room's cozy ambience. Business dealings, that's what he calls them. Smuggling, Miss Marple. Stolen goods, jewels. Bonds, things I didn't even want to know about until he dragged me into it. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. He's built an empire on lies, and that greenhouse is just the start of it. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if itching to pick up her knitting again, but she kept them still. The greenhouse, she murmured, her tone encouraging. I noticed a rather unusual orchid there, quite striking, with those deep purple petals and golden veins. Not the sort of thing one finds in every garden. Lydia's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked as if she might faint. You saw it, she whispered. The orchid. It's not just a flower, Miss Marple. It's a signal, a code. Every shipment that comes through Seabury is marked with that orchid crates, documents. Even the pins people wear at his blasted galas. It's how they know who's part of the operation. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The orchid she'd seen pinned to Lydia's dress at the gala hadn't been a mere accessory, it was a mark of complicity. Or perhaps coercion. And you, my dear, she said gently. How did you come to wear that orchid? Lydia's hands trembled, and she set her handbag on the table, as if it were too heavy to hold any longer. I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice breaking. Victor, he knows things about me. Things from years ago, when I was young and foolish. A scandal that would ruin me if it came out. He's held it over my head for years, forcing me to play along. To act as his eyes and ears at those wretched events. I'm his sister, but I'm also his prisoner. Miss Marple's heart ached for the young woman, but her mind remained sharp, sifting through the details. And the greenhouse, she prompted. Mr. Harrow's role in all this? Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. Harrow's one of Victor's lackeys. The greenhouse is a fronted place to store the contraband before it's moved inland. Those orchids are grown specially, in small batches, to mark the shipments. Harrow's terrified of Victor, but he's too greedy to walk away. They all are. Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her mind conjuring an image of St. Mary Mead's own Mr. Phipps, the village grocer, who always seemed to know more about his customers' lives than he let on. People like Harrow, she thought, were often the weak link in such schemes, loyal until fear or greed tipped the balance. And the safe in Victor's study, she said, her tone casual, as if discussing the weather. You mentioned it at the gala. What's in it? Lydia froze, her eyes darting to the tea room's door, as if expecting Victor himself to burst through. You heard that? She whispered. I shouldn't have said anything. But since you already know. She swallowed hard. The safe holds evidence ledgers, letters, maps, everything that ties Victor to the syndicate. If anyone got their hands on it, his whole empire would collapse. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. Then we must get our hands on it, my dear. But we'll need to be clever. Victor strikes me as a man who doesn't leave loose ends. Lydia's face paled, but there was a flicker of resolve in her eyes. I've wanted to be free of him for years, she said. If you can help me, Miss Marple, I'll do whatever it takes. There's a town event tomorrow night, a masquerade ball at the Assembly Hall. Victor will be there, showing off as usual. It might be our chance. Miss Marple smiled, her mind already spinning a plan as intricate as one of her lace doilies. A masquerade ball, she mused. How delightful. I've always thought masks reveal more than they hide. Tell me, my dear, do you know the layout of Victor's estate? Lydia nodded, pulling a small notebook from her handbag. She sketched a quick map of the estate, her pen moving with the precision of someone who'd spent too many hours under her brother's roof. The study is here, she said, pointing to a room on the second floor. The safe is behind a painting of a ship. It's locked, of course, but I've seen him open it once. The combination, I think it's tied to his birthday, but I'm not certain. Miss Marple studied the sketch, committing every detail to memory. You've done well, Lydia, she said, her voice warm but firm. Now, let's make a plan. At the ball, we'll need a distraction, something to keep Victor and his men occupied while I slip into the study. Can you manage that? Lydia hesitated, then nodded. I can. There's always a moment at these events when Victor gives a speech. Everyone's focused on him. I could faint or spill something, make a scene. It would give you a few minutes, at least. Miss Marple's smile widened. Perfect. And don't worry, my dear. I've found that a well-timed mishap can open all sorts of doors. The conversation shifted to logistics, Lydia's role, the timing, the risks. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind weaving together the threads of Lydia's confession with the clues she'd gathered so far. The orchid, the ledger, the smuggled jewels, the coded map, they all pointed to a network far larger than Seabury, with Victor Crane at its heart. But it was the human element Lydia's fear. Tom's coercion, Harrow's greed that gave her the leverage she needed. As the tea room began to empty, Miss Marple glanced at her watch. We should part ways soon, my dear, she said. It wouldn't do for us to be seen together too long. But before you go, tell me one thing. Why now? Why risk everything to help me? Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Because I'm tired, Miss Marple. tired of living in his shadow, tired of being afraid. When I saw you at the gala, watching everyone so closely, I don't know. I felt like you were someone who could actually stop him. Miss Marple reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on Lydia's. You're braver than you know, my dear. And I promise you, we'll see this through together. Lydia managed a small smile, the first genuine one Miss Marple had seen. Tomorrow night, then, she said, at the masquerade ball. Tomorrow night. Miss Marple echoed, her voice steady. Wear something eye-catching, my dear. It will make your distraction all the more effective. As Lydia left the tea room, her hat tilted to shield her face. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, her needles moving with a calm, deliberate rhythm. The plan was in motion, but she knew the dangers. Victor Crane was no ordinary criminal. He was cunning, charismatic, and ruthless. The safe in his study held the key to dismantling his empire, but getting to it would require every ounce of her wit and guile. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already at the masquerade ball, navigating the crowded room, slipping past guards, and cracking the safe. The orchid, she thought, was more than a clue. It was a symbol of Victor's arrogance, his belief that he could hide his crimes in plain sight. But arrogance, as she'd learned in St. Mary Mead, was often a villain's undoing. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Miss Marple visited a local seamstress, selecting a simple but elegant mask adorned with silver feathers, a disguise that would blend in with the ball's opulence without drawing undue attention. She spent the afternoon reviewing Lydia's sketch, memorizing the estate's layout, and considering every possible contingency. If Harrow was at the ball, he might recognize her. If Victor suspected anything, he could tighten security. And if the safe's combination was wrong, well, she'd cross that bridge when she came to it. By evening, Seabury's assembly hall was transformed into a glittering spectacle. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, their light reflecting off jeweled masks and silk gowns. The air buzzed with laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. But Miss Marple felt the undercurrent of tension, the watchful eyes of Victor's men, the forced smiles of those in his debt. She spotted Lydia across the room, resplendent in a deep emerald gown, the orchid pin gleaming at her shoulder. Their eyes met briefly, a silent agreement passing between them. As the orchestra struck up a waltz, Miss Marple moved through the crowd, her mask concealing the sharp focus in her eyes. She chatted with a local magistrate about the weather, complimented a dowager on her pearls, and all the while kept Victor in her peripheral vision. He stood near the center of the room, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile charming. But there was a hardness in his eyes, a predator's gaze that missed nothing. When the clock struck 9, Victor stepped onto a small platform, raising a glass to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. Tonight, we celebrate Seabury's spirit, its resilience, its beauty, and its future. The crowd applauded, but Miss Marple's attention was on Lydia, who stood near the edge of the room, her hand trembling as she clutched a glass of champagne. As Victor's speech reached its crescendo, Lydia let out a dramatic gasp, her glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. She swayed, clutching her chest, and sank to her knees, drawing gasps and murmurs from the crowd. "Oh, dear," Miss Marple exclaimed, playing her part as the concerned bystander. "Someone help the poor girl." As guests rushed to Lydia's side, Miss Marple slipped away, her steps light but purposeful. She navigated the hall's side corridor, avoiding the servants bustling with trays of canapes. The staircase to the second floor was unguarded, just as Lydia had promised. Miss Marple climbed it swiftly, her heart pounding not with fear but with the thrill of the chase. The study was exactly where Lydia's sketch had indicated, its door slightly ajar. Miss Marple slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. The room was dimly lit, with heavy oak furniture and a large painting of a ship dominating one wall. She moved to the painting, her fingers tracing its frame until she found the catch. It swung open, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. Her hands were steady as she turned the dial, trying the combination Lydia had suggested. Victor's birthday, December 15, 1890. The safe clicked open, and Miss Marple's breath caught. Inside was a treasure trove of evidence, ledgers listing transactions in coded shorthand, letters bearing the orchid seal, and a folded map marked with a single location: an abandoned lighthouse on the cliffs. But before she could examine the map, the door creaked behind her. Miss Marple spun around, her heart leaping as she saw Mr. Harrow standing in the doorway, his face twisted with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" he growled, stepping into the room. "This isn't a place for old ladies to wander." Miss Marple's mind raced, but her voice remained calm. "Oh, my dear Mr. Harrow, I seem to have gotten lost. I was looking for the powder room, you see, and this door was open." Harrow's eyes narrowed, and he took another step forward. "Don't play games with me. I saw you at the greenhouse, snooping around. You're not just some nosy old bat, are you?" Miss Marple's hand slipped into her handbag, closing around a small silver hairpin. "I assure you, Mr. Harrow, I'm quite harmless. But I do wonder, what's a florist doing in a study at a masquerade ball, looking for something? Perhaps Harrow's face flushed, and he muttered something about a double cross. Miss Marple seized the moment, stepping to the side as if to leave. "Well, I won't keep you, dear. I'm sure you have important business to attend to." As Harrow hesitated, torn between confronting her and his own agenda, Miss Marple slipped past him, the map tucked inside her cardigan. She made it to the corridor just as the music from the ball swelled, masking the sound of her footsteps. Her heart raced, but her mind was clear. The lighthouse was the next piece of the puzzle, and she was one step closer to unraveling Victor Crane's empire. Back in the tea room the next morning, Miss Marple sipped her tea, the map spread out in her mind's eye. Lydia's confession had been the key, and the masquerade ball had given her the evidence she needed. But the game was far from over. The lighthouse held secrets, and Victor Crane was still at large, his arrogance unchecked. Miss Marple smiled to herself, her knitting needles clicking once more. One clue, one rare orchid, had set her on this path, and she would follow it to the end. Chapter 7. The Masquerade Ball. Night of Seabury's annual masquerade ball draped the coastal town in an air of mystery, as if the very stars conspired to cloak themselves behind wisps of cloud. The grand hall of Victor Crane's mansion glowed like a jewel against the dark cliffs, its windows spilling golden light onto the manicured lawns. Miss Jane Marple, her silver hair tucked beneath an elegant velvet mask adorned with peacock feathers, stepped lightly from the hired car. Her gown, a deep sapphire that shimmered faintly under the lanterns, was borrowed from a theatrical friend in St. Mary Mead, an old costume from a forgotten play. But it suited her purpose perfectly. She was not here to dance or revel. She was here to slip into the heart of a criminal empire, armed with nothing but her wits and a single clue: the rare orchid, the invitation to the ball, secured through a carefully worded conversation with a flustered charity organizer, felt crisp in her gloved hand as she presented it to the footman at the door. He barely glanced at it, his eyes darting nervously to the crowd behind her. The hall buzzed with Seabury's elite merchants, landowners, and whispered names from London's underbelly, all hidden behind masks of silk, leather, and guilt. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the clink of champagne flutes. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the undercurrent of tension. A man in a wolf mask lingered too long near the staircase. A woman in scarlet adjusted her fan with a flicker of unease. This was no ordinary ball. It was a stage, and every guest played a part. She moved through the crowd with the ease of a shadow, her small stature and unassuming air making her nearly invisible. To the untrained eye, she was just another elderly guest, perhaps a dowager, aunt or a retired governess indulging in a night of nostalgia. But her mind was a steel trap, cataloging every detail. The way a waiter's hand trembled as he passed a tray, the glint of a gold cufflink shaped like an orchid on a man's sleeve, the fleeting glance between two masked figures near the ballroom's edge. She had come for one purpose, to find Victor Crane's study and the safe Lydia had described, which held evidence of his smuggling empire. But first, she needed to blend in. "May I have this dance, madam?" A voice, smooth as polished oak, interrupted her thoughts. A tall man in a black domino mask bowed slightly, his dark eyes gleaming with amusement. His tailcoat was impeccably tailored, and a single orchid boutonniere pinned to his lapel sent a shiver of recognition through her. Miss Marple smiled, her lips curling with the practiced charm of a woman who had navigated countless drawing rooms. "Oh, I'm afraid my dancing days are long behind me," she said, her voice light but firm. "But I'd be delighted to chat. You seem a gentleman of discerning taste." Her eyes flicked to the orchid, and his smile tightened imperceptibly. "Victor Crane," he said, extending a hand. "And you are Miss Primrose," she replied, choosing a name as innocuous as her appearance. She took his hand briefly, noting the strength in his grip and the faint callus on his thumb. A man who handled more than ledgers. "I've heard such tales of your hospitality, Mr. Crane. This ball is quite the spectacle," he chuckled, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, where velvet drapes muffled the music. "Seabury thrives on spectacle, Miss Primrose. But I suspect you're not one for idle gossip. You have the look of someone who sees more than she says." Her heart quickened, but her expression remained serene. "Oh, I'm just a visitor, Mr. Crane. I find people so very interesting, don't you? The stories they tell, and the ones they don't." His eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a woman in a silver mask swept up, her gown trailing like moonlight. "Victor, you promised me the next waltz," she said, her voice sharp with possessiveness. Miss Marple recognized the tone. Lydia Crane's estranged sister, though her mask hid her face. The orchid pinned to her bodice confirmed it. "Of course, my dear," Crane said, his tone smooth but edged with irritation. He bowed to Miss Marple. "Excuse me, Miss Primrose. Enjoy the evening." As he led Lydia to the dance floor, Miss Marple melted back into the crowd, her mind racing. Crane was watchful, but Lydia's presence offered an opportunity. Their earlier meeting in the tea room had cemented a fragile alliance. Lydia's fear of her brother outweighed her loyalty, and she had agreed to help Miss Marple access the study during the ball. The plan was simple. Lydia would create a distraction, and Miss Marple would slip upstairs. But Crane's sharpness and the orchid's omnipresence suggested the stakes were higher than she'd anticipated. She drifted toward the grand staircase, pausing to admire a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor. The frame bore a faint carving of an orchid, almost invisible unless you knew to look. Her fingers brushed the wood, and she felt a hidden panel. Perhaps. Before she could investigate, a voice hissed behind her. "Miss Primrose, is it?" It was Mr. Harrow, the florist, his fox mask doing little to hide his nervous energy. His hands twitched, and his eyes darted to the staircase. "You're awfully curious for a guest. Miss Marple turned, her smile disarming. Oh, Mr. Harrow, how lovely to see you. I was just admiring the craftsmanship. These old houses are full of surprises, aren't they? His jaw tightened. Some surprises are best left alone. The study's upstairs, but it's locked. Mr. Crane doesn't like snoopers. Locked, you say? She replied, her tone airy. Well, I wouldn't dream of intruding. I'm far too old for such adventures. She patted his arm, noting the sweat on his brow. Harrow was involved, but he was no mastermind. He was afraid of Crane, of the syndicate, or perhaps of her. Before he could press further, a crash echoed from the ballroom. Glasses shattered, and a woman's voice, Lydia's, rose in mock distress. Oh, my goodness, my dress. The crowd surged toward the commotion, and Harrow hesitated, torn between watching Miss Marple and investigating the noise. Go on, dear, Miss Marple urged, her voice gentle. It sounds like someone needs help. He muttered something and hurried off, leaving her alone. She seized the moment, gliding up the staircase with surprising agility for a woman of her years. The upper hall was dim, lit only by flickering sconces. Portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her as she counted doors. Lydia had said the study was the third on the left. Behind a heavy oak door with an orchid carved into the lintel, she found it easily, the carving unmistakable. The door was indeed locked, but Miss Marple had come prepared. From her reticule, she produced a small hairpin, a trick learned from a long ago maid with a penchant for locked diaries. The lock was old, more decorative than secure, and it yielded. With a soft click, she slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The study was a sanctuary of wealth mahogany shelves, leather-bound books, and a massive desk that dominated the room. A single orchid in a crystal vase sat on the windowsill, its petals glowing in the moonlight. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, landing on a portrait of Crane's late father above the fireplace. Lydia had mentioned a safe hidden behind it. She approached, her fingers tracing the frame. A faint seam suggested a hinge, and with a gentle push, the portrait swung forward, revealing a steel safe embedded in the wall. The combination lock gleamed, its numbers stark against the metal. Miss Marple's heart sank. Lydia hadn't known the code, and she had no time to guess. Footsteps echoed in the hall. She froze, her breath catching as the door creaked open. Harrow stood there, his mask gone, his face pale with suspicion. I knew you weren't just a guest, he hissed, stepping inside. What are you after? Miss Marple's mind raced, but her voice remained calm. Mr. Harrow, you startled me. I was just admiring the view. The moonlight is quite lovely from here. Don't play the fool, he snapped, advancing. You're after the safe, aren't you? What do you know about the shipments? She backed toward the desk, her hands brushing its surface. Her fingers closed around a heavy paperweight, an orchid carved in obsidian. Shipments, she said, feigning confusion. I'm just an old woman with a fondness for flowers. Speaking of which, that orchid is exquisite. Where did you get it? He faltered, thrown by her tone. You're lying. You've been poking around my greenhouse, too. Who sent you? No one sent me, dear, she said, her eyes locking onto his. But you seem awfully nervous. Is there something you're afraid of? Perhaps a double cross? His face blanched, and she knew she'd struck a nerve. The ledger in the greenhouse had hinted at tensions within the syndicate, and Harrow's fear confirmed it. He was a weak link, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. Before he could respond, a shout came from downstairs, Lydia's voice, louder now, calling for Crane. Harrow hesitated, and Miss Marple seized her chance. She stepped closer, her voice low and steady. Mr. Harrow, you don't strike me as a villain. Just a man in over his head. If you're worried about Mr. Crane, perhaps we could help each other. His eyes widened, but before he could answer, the door burst open again. This time, it was Crane himself. His mask discarded, his face a mask of controlled fury. Harrow. What's this? He demanded, his gaze shifting to Miss Marple. And you, Miss Primrose or whatever your name is, step away from the safe. Miss Marple's heart pounded, but she smiled serenely. Mr. Crane, I was just telling Mr. Harrow how much I admire your taste in decor. This orchid is quite remarkable. Crane's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. You're no tourist, he said. Who are you working for? The police, the syndicate? Oh, no one so grand, she replied, her tone light. Just a curious old lady who can't resist a puzzle. And this safe, it's quite the puzzle, isn't it? Harrow shifted nervously, his eyes darting between them. Crane's hand moved to his pocket, and Miss Marple's grip tightened on the paperweight. The room crackled with tension, the distant music of the ball a mocking counterpoint. Then, inspiration struck. She glanced at the orchid on the windowsill, its petals catching the light. You know, she said, her voice thoughtful, I once read that orchids can symbolize many things: beauty, secrecy, even betrayal. I wonder what this one means to you, Mr. Crane. His expression faltered just for a moment, and she saw. At the flicker of doubt, she pressed on, her voice soft but relentless. The combination, I suspect, has something to do with that flower. Perhaps the number of petals, or the year you first acquired it. Crane laughed, but it was forced. You're grasping, old woman. Am I? She stepped closer to the safe, her fingers brushing the dial. She had no idea if she was right, but she needed to keep him off balance. Let's try 5 for the petals. She turned the dial, hearing a faint click. And perhaps 7 for the leaves. Another click. Her heart raced. She was guessing, but the safe's mechanism was old, and she'd seen similar ones in her youth. Harrow's breath hitched, and Crane's face darkened. Enough, he snapped, lunging forward. But Miss Marple was ready. She swung the paperweight, not to strike, but to distract, tossing it toward the window. It shattered the glass, and the sudden crash sent Crane and Harrow reeling in the chaos. She spun the dial one last time. 22, a wild guess based on the year Crane's father died. A detail Lydia had mentioned. The safe clicked open, revealing a stack of papers and a small, coded map. She grabbed the map, tucking it into her reticule, and darted for the door. Stop her, Crane roared, but the ballroom's commotion had spilled into the hall, guests milling about in confusion. Miss Marple slipped into the crowd, her mask still in place, her heart pounding with triumph. The map pointed to an abandoned lighthouse, a new piece of the puzzle. As she melted into the sea of masked faces, she heard Crane's voice barking orders. But she was already gone, a shadow among shadows. The night was far from over, but Miss Marple had what she came for. The orchid had led her here, and now the lighthouse would lead her further. She adjusted her mask, her lips curving into a quiet smile. The game was afoot, and she was one step ahead. Chapter 8. The lighthouse riddled wind howled across the jagged cliffs of Seabury, carrying the sharp tang of salt and seaweed. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a sensible woolen coat and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the gusts, stood at the edge of the coastal path, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. To any passerby, she was merely an elderly woman indulging a quaint hobby, capturing the wild beauty of the sea in charcoal and paper. But her keen eyes, hidden behind the pretense of an artist's squint, were fixed on the crumbling silhouette of the old Seabury lighthouse, its weathered stone tower looming against the bruised sky. The coded map she had retrieved from Victor Crane's safe the previous night weighed heavily in her mind, though the physical document was safely tucked inside her handbag, nestled between a packet of peppermint humbugs and a well-worn copy of the vicar's sermons. The map had been a triumph, its cryptic lines and symbols pointing to this very lighthouse as the nerve center of Crane's smuggling operation. Yet, as she gazed at the structure, its boarded windows and rusted lantern room gave no hint of the secrets it held. Miss Marple's lips pursed in quiet determination. She had unraveled many a knot in her time, and this one, however tangled, would be no different. Her pretext for visiting the lighthouse was simple: a polite request to the Seabury Historical Society for permission to sketch the picturesque ruin for a supposed article in a provincial magazine. The Society's secretary, a fussy man named Mr. Tuttle, had been delighted by her interest, prattling on about the lighthouse's history as a beacon for ships in the 19th century. He had granted her access without a second thought, assuming her to be nothing more than a harmless spinster with a penchant for nostalgia. Miss Marple had smiled demurely, her eyes twinkling with the knowledge that her true purpose was far less innocent. As she approached the lighthouse, the path grew uneven, stones slick with moss and sea spray. She stepped carefully, her sturdy shoes crunching against the gravel. The door, a heavy slab of oak weathered to a silvery gray, was ajar, its hinges creaking as the wind nudged it back and forth. Miss Marple paused, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The air inside smelled of damp stone and something sharper oil, perhaps, or the faint metallic tang of machinery. She adjusted her hat, tucking a stray wisp of white hair beneath it, and stepped inside. The interior was dim, the only light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows, casting slivers of gray across the spiral staircase that wound up the tower's core. Dust motes danced in the air, and the faint drip of water echoed from somewhere above. Miss Marple's sketchbook felt suddenly superfluous, but she clutched it tighter, maintaining the fiction of her visit. She began to climb the stairs, her steps slow but deliberate, her ears attuned to every sound. The lighthouse was supposed to be abandoned, yet there was a faint hum, almost imperceptible, vibrating through the stone walls. Machinery, she thought, or perhaps something more sinister. At the first landing, she paused to catch her breath, her hand resting on the cold iron railing. A narrow corridor branched off, leading to a small room that must have once housed the keeper's supplies. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the walls for anything out of place. The room was bare save for a rusted lantern and a pile of rotting rope. But as she turned to leave, her foot brushed against a loose floorboard. It shifted slightly, emitting a faint creak. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers probing the edges of the board. It lifted easily, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Her heart quickened as she reached inside, her fingers brushing against a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a stack of documents, bills of lading, shipping manifests, and a series of coded letters, all stamped with the same orchid symbol she had seen on the crates at the dock. The documents detailed shipments of contraband jewels, rare artifacts, and even forged bonds moving through Seabury to a syndicate in London. One phrase leapt out: final delivery to destabilize the region. The words sent a chill through her. This was no petty smuggling ring. Crane's ambitions reached far beyond Seabury's shores. She tucked the documents into her handbag, replacing the floorboard with care. As she stood, a shadow flickered across the doorway. Instinctively, she stepped back into the corner, her small frame blending into the gloom. A man entered, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years at sea. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something. Miss Marple held her breath, her fingers tightening around her sketchbook. The man muttered under his breath something about Harrow's mistake before turning and disappearing down the corridor. Miss Marple waited until his footsteps faded before slipping out of the room. She needed to explore further, but caution was paramount. The lighthouse was a labyrinth of secrets, and she was not alone. She continued up the spiral staircase, her senses alert. At the top, the lantern room was a skeleton of its former self, the massive lens long gone, replaced by cobwebs and broken glass. But in the center of the room stood a wooden crate, its lid partially pried open. She approached, peering inside. It was empty, but the interior was lined with velvet, the kind used to transport delicate valuables. Another orchid symbol was burned into the wood. A sudden noise, a sharp clatter from below made her freeze. She moved to the edge of the lantern room, peering down through a gap in the floorboards. The man from earlier was back, now joined by another figure, smaller and warier. With unnervous energy, she recognized him instantly, Mr. Harrow, the florist. His voice was low but urgent, carrying up to her hiding place. "They're onto us, I tell you," Harrow said, his words clipped with panic. That old woman was sniffing around the greenhouse. "She's not what she seems," the taller man grunted. "Crane said to keep things tight. No loose ends." "You sure she's not just some nosy tourist?" She asked about the orchids, Harrow hissed. "The orchids. Nobody knows about them unless they're in deep." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Her innocent questions had clearly rattled Harrow more than she'd intended. But the taller man's next words wiped the smile from her face. "Then we deal with her, quietly. Crane's orders." Her pulse quickened, but she remained still, her mind racing. She needed to leave the lighthouse without being seen. But the documents in her handbag were too valuable to abandon. And there was still the matter of the map's remaining codes. She had deciphered only part of it. Enough to know the syndicate's next meeting was at a manor owned by Lord Pennington. But the details were maddeningly vague. She needed time to think, to piece together the puzzle. But time was not on her side. The men's voices grew fainter as they moved toward the base of the tower. Miss Marple crept to the staircase, her movements silent despite her age. She descended, carefully, pausing at each landing to listen. At the ground floor, she spotted a narrow window, its boards loose enough to slip through. She glanced at her sketchbook, then at the window. The pretense of sketching would have to wait. Survival was the priority now. She pushed the boards aside, wincing at the faint creak, and squeezed through the gap, her handbag catching briefly on a splinter. Outside, the wind whipped at her coat, but she welcomed the fresh air. She hurried along the cliff path, her mind already turning to the next step. The documents confirmed the lighthouse's role as a hub for Crane's operations. But the final delivery hinted at something larger, a scheme that could, as the papers suggested, destabilize the region. What could it mean? A financial collapse, a political scandal? She needed to reach the manor. But first, she had to decode the rest of the map. Back at her rented cottage in Seabury, Miss Marple spread the documents across the dining table, her teacup steaming beside her. The coded map was a masterpiece of misdirection, its symbols layered with meaning. She recognized a few from her nephew Raymond's cryptography books, which she had read with mild curiosity during a rainy summer at St. Mary Mead. One symbol, a crescent moon bisected by a line, appeared repeatedly. She traced it with her finger, her memory nudging her toward a solution. It was a cipher used by smugglers in the 18th century, one she had encountered in a dusty volume at the Vicarage Library. With a pencil, she began to decode the map, her hand steady despite the late hour. The map revealed a precise location, Pennington Manor. a sprawling estate 10 miles inland, owned by the reclusive Lord Pennington. The syndicate's meeting was scheduled for the following evening, disguised as a private dinner for charitable donors. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. Pennington's involvement was unexpected but not surprising. In her experience, wealth and respectability often masked the darkest secrets. She would need a way into the manor, and she would need it fast. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the Seabury Historical Society again, this time inquiring about Pennington Manor's architectural history. Mr. Tuttle, ever eager to share his knowledge, mentioned an upcoming tour of the manor for select historians. Miss Marple's eyes lit up behind her spectacles. "Oh, how fascinating," she said, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. Might there be room for one more? By noon, she had secured an invitation, her guise as a historian as convincing as her earlier role as an artist. She spent the afternoon preparing, choosing a modest dress and a shawl that would allow her to blend into the manor's opulent surroundings. The documents from the lighthouse were hidden in a false bottom of her suitcase, a trick she had learned from a rather disreputable cousin in her youth. As she boarded the bus to the manor, her mind was already mapping out the evening. The lighthouse had given her the evidence she needed. The manor would reveal the faces behind the empire. The bus rattled along the winding roads, and Miss Marple gazed out at the rolling hills, her thoughts drifting to the orchid. It was more than a symbol. She realized it was a signal, a way, for Crane's operatives to identify one another. The flower pinned to Lydia's dress at the gala, the marks on the crates, the carvings she expected to find at the manor, they were all part of the same web, and at its center was Victor Crane, a man whose charm and wealth had shielded him for too long. But webs, Miss Marple knew, could be unraveled with a single tug dot as the bus neared Pennington Manor. The sky darkened, a storm brewing on the horizon. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and stepped off the bus, her sketchbook once again under her arm. The manor loomed ahead, its turrets stark against the gathering clouds. She smiled faintly. The lighthouse had been the first thread, the manor would be the next, and with every step, she was closer to toppling an empire. Chapter 9. The manor's shadowsmith Jane Marple adjusted the brim of her sensible hat, her eyes sharp beneath the soft gray curls framing her face. The air was crisp with the scent of autumn leaves as she approached Pennington Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in a secluded valley just beyond Seabury's coastal cliffs. The manor's Gothic spires loomed against the bruised sky, their jagged silhouettes hinting at secrets older than the smuggling ring she was unraveling. Posing as a historian researching local architecture, she had secured an invitation to tour the manor, owned by the reclusive Lord Pennington. Her true purpose, however, was to confirm her suspicions. The rare orchid, that singular clue from the anonymous letter, tied this place to Victor Crane's criminal empire. The manor's iron gates creaked open, revealing a gravel path lined with gnarled oaks. Miss Marple's walking stick tapped a steady rhythm as she approached, her modest tweed coat and spectacles lending her the air of a harmless academic. The butler, a gaunt man with eyes like polished flint, greeted her at the entrance. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, his voice as dry as the leaves underfoot. "Lord Pennington awaits you in the library." "Thank you, Mr." she prompted, her tone warm but probing. "Graves, madam," he replied, offering no further pleasantries as he led her through the cavernous foyer. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every step. Miss Marple noted the faint scent of orchids drifting through the air, though no flowers were visible. Her heart quickened. The clue was here, woven into the very fabric of this place. The library was a vast chamber of dark wood and towering shelves, lit by a chandelier that cast flickering shadows. Lord Pennington stood by a roaring fire, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, extending a hand. "A pleasure to meet a scholar of your repute. I understand you're interested in the manor's history." "Oh, indeed," she replied, her voice light but her mind razor-sharp. "These old houses have such stories to tell, don't they? I'm particularly fascinated by the craftsmanship, say. Those carvings on the furniture. Quite unique." Pennington's smile tightened, but he gestured toward a mahogany table nearby. "Yes, the manor's furnishings are rather special. Some date back centuries." Miss Marple's eyes darted to the table, where intricate orchid motifs were etched into the wood, their delicate petals curling like secrets. The same symbol she'd seen on the crates at the dock, in Harrow's greenhouse, and pinned to Lydia's dress at the gala. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her expression serene, as if admiring mere artistry. "Exquisite," she murmured, running a gloved finger over the carving. "Almost like a signature, wouldn't you say?" Pennington's gaze flickered, but he recovered quickly. "A family emblem, you might say. Now, shall we begin the tour?" As they moved through the manor's labyrinthine halls, Miss Marple catalogued every detail: the creak of a loose floorboard, the faint outline of a concealed door behind a tapestry, the way Graves lingered just out of earshot. Pennington spoke at length about the manor's history, battles fought, fortunes won and lost, but his words felt rehearsed, a performance to distract from something hidden. She nodded politely, her mind elsewhere, piecing together the puzzle. The orchid was no mere flower. It was a signal, a mark of allegiance among the conspirators. And Pennington, with his polished charm and guarded eyes, was no bystander. They paused in a grand dining hall, where a long table gleamed under crystal chandeliers. "This room has hosted many a gathering," Pennington said, his tone nostalgic. "Though I prefer solitude these days. Solitude suits reflection." Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the room. A sideboard caught her attention, its surface adorned with another orchid carving. "Though I imagine you entertain the occasional guest. Perhaps Mr. Victor Crane?" Pennington's hand froze on the back of a chair, his knuckles whitening. "Crane," he said, his voice smooth but edged, "a passing acquaintance." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, just village gossip," she said airily, her smile disarming. "Seabury's full of it. You know, I heard he's quite the philanthropist." Pennington relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained wary. "He's generous, yes, but I'm not one for town chatter." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a maid, a young woman with nervous hands and downcast eyes. "Your tea, my lord," she said, setting a tray on the sideboard. Miss Marple noted the maid's trembling fingers and the way she avoided Pennington's gaze. Something was amiss, but she filed it away for later. As the tour continued, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The manor was a fortress of secrets, and Pennington was its gatekeeper. She needed evidence, something concrete to tie him to Crane's syndicate. Her chance came unexpectedly when a distant crash echoed through the halls, followed by raised voices. Pennington excused himself, his face a mask of irritation. "A minor issue in the kitchens, no doubt. Graves will show you to the drawing room." Graves led her to a plush room filled with velvet drapes and gilded mirrors. But Miss Marple had no intention of sitting idly. The moment he left, she slipped back into the corridor, her steps silent on the thick rugs. The manor's layout was a maze, but her keen sense of direction guided her toward the source of the noisiest servants' staircase, leading to the upper floors. She climbed swiftly, her heart pounding not with fear but with the thrill of the chase. At the top, she found a narrow hallway lined with locked doors. One door, slightly ajar, revealed a glimpse of a study. She eased it open, her eyes scanning for traps or prying eyes. The room was cluttered with papers, maps, and ledgers. But what caught her attention was a small wooden box on the desk, its lid carved with, you guessed it, an orchid. Her fingers itched to open it, but caution prevailed. Instead, she moved to a bookshelf where a faint seam suggested a hidden panel. With a gentle push, it clicked open, revealing a stack of documents. Her hands moved quickly, flipping through pages. Shipping manifests, coded letters, and a list of named syndicate members. She was certain. Among them, Sir Henry Walton's name stood out, confirming her suspicions about the politician. But there was more. A schedule for a final delivery, marked for next week at a warehouse outside London. Her mind raced. This was the evidence she needed, but she had to act fast. A sudden flicker plunged the room into darkness. The power outage was unexpected, and Miss Marple froze, her senses heightened. Footsteps echoed in the distance, too heavy to be the maid's, too deliberate to be casual. She slipped the list into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the small notebook she always carried. With practiced ease, she memorized the key details, names, dates, locations. The footsteps grew closer, and she eased the panel shut, retreating to a corner behind a heavy curtain. The door creaked open, and a figure entered, their silhouette barely visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. It was Pennington, his voice low and urgent as he spoke into a handheld radio. "Crane, we've got a problem. Someone's been asking questions. That Marple woman, she's no historian." Miss Marple's breath caught, but she remained still, her knitting needles tucked into her bag as a potential weapon. Pennington continued, oblivious to her presence. "We need to move the delivery up. Tomorrow night. Same warehouse. And make sure Harrow's on board. He's getting twitchy." The radio crackled with Crane's voice, sharp and commanding. "Handle it, Pennington. If she's a threat, deal with her. We're too close to lose everything now." Pennington muttered something inaudible and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Miss Marple waited, counting to 60 before emerging. The power outage had been a stroke of luck, but it wouldn't last. She slipped out of the study, her mind racing with the new information. Tomorrow night. The warehouse, the final delivery. She had to get this to Inspector Davies, but first, she needed to escape the manor undetected. The hallway was still dark, but faint emergency lights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows. She moved quickly, retracing her steps to the drawing room. As she reached the main staircase, she heard voices below Graves and the maid, arguing in hushed tones. "She's not what she seems," the maid whispered. "I saw her looking at the carvings. She knows something. Let his lordship deal with it." Graves snapped. "You keep your mouth shut, Ellie." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Ellie, the maid, was a weak link, scared, perhaps coerced. She filed the name away, knowing it might prove useful. For now, she needed an exit. The drawing room's French doors led to a terrace overlooking the gardens, and she slipped outside. The cool night air a relief after the manor's stifling tension. The gates were too far, but a low wall bordered the estate, and she was spry enough to manage it. As she crossed the garden, a figure stepped from the shadows, a young man in a gardener's cap, his face pale in the moonlight. "You're her, aren't you?" he said, his voice trembling. "The one asking about the orchids." Miss Marple's hand tightened on her walking stick, but her smile was gentle. "And you are, Jem," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "I work the grounds. I heard you talking to his lordship. You're not here for the history, are you?" She studied him, noting the fear in his eyes and the way his hands fidgeted. Another soul caught in Crane's web, perhaps. Let's just say I'm curious, she replied. And you, Jem, what's got you so nervous? He hesitated, then leaned closer. They're watching you. Pennington, Crane, all of them. There's a room in the west wing locked tight. That's where they keep the real stuff. I've seen crates go in, marked with that flower. Her heart leapt, but she kept her tone calm. Thank you, Jem. You've been very brave. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a train to catch. He nodded, stepping back into the shadows. Be careful, miss. They don't like loose ends, miss. Marple scaled the wall with surprising agility, her mind a whirlwind of plans. The list in her pocket was a ticking bomb, and tomorrow's delivery was her chance to end Crane's empire. But Pennington's words haunted her. If she's a threat, deal with her. She'd have to move carefully, but caution had always been her ally. As she reached the lane beyond the manor, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the Gothic spires one last time. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her lips curving into a determined smile. One clue, one flower, had brought her this far. Now, it would bring down an empire. Chapter 10. The politician's gambit air in London carried a crisp bite, the kind that sharpened the senses and made the city's pulse feel both urgent and alive. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a modest wool coat and her favorite wear-upon scarf, stepped off the train at Paddington Station, her eyes scanning the bustling platform with the quiet alertness of a seasoned observer. The capital's clamor, newspaper boys shouting headlines, the clatter of taxis. The hum of hurried footsteps was a stark contrast to the sleepy lanes of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple felt no unease. If anything, the city's chaos was a stage, and she, an unassuming player, was ready to perform her part. Her mission was clear: track down Sir Henry Walton, the prominent politician whose name had surfaced on the syndicate's list in the manor's shadows. The list, now etched in her memory, was a web of names: merchants, aristocrats, and officials, all tethered to Victor Crane's smuggling empire. Sir Henry, with his polished speeches and public charm, was the linchpin. If she could unravel his role, she might topple the entire operation. The discarded note she'd found in his coat pocket at the manor, a cryptic scrawl hinting at a betrayal within the syndicate, had given her the leverage she needed. It read, C's empire must fall. Meet at the usual place. Midnight. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged, as if written in a moment of panic. Sir Henry, it seemed, was plotting to save himself by exposing Crane. Miss Marple intended to use that desperation to her advantage. She adjusted her hat, a simple affair with a single feather, and made her way to a small cafe across from the station. The bell and whistle was a cozy nook, its windows fogged with steam and its tables crowded with travelers and locals alike. She chose a corner seat, ordered a pot of Earl Grey, and opened a copy of the Times, pretending to read well. Her eyes flicked toward the door. The fundraiser where Sir Henry would appear was hours away, set for that evening at the Grand Burlington Hall. She had time to plan, to observe, to let the city reveal its secrets. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the orchid clue that had brought her this far. That rare flower, with its delicate purple petals and elusive origins, was more than a signal among conspirators. It was a thread weaving through every layer of Crane's empire, from the greenhouse in Seabury to the pin on Lydia's dress. It marked the guilty like a silent accusation. Now, in London, she suspected it would appear again, perhaps in Sir Henry's orbit, tying him to the syndicate's heart. The fundraiser was a glittering affair, hosted by a charitable foundation. Sir Henry chaired. The invitation, secured through a discreet favor from a St. Mary Mead acquaintance with London connections, described an evening of music, speeches, and donations for a children's hospital. Miss Marple had no illusions about the event's true purpose. Such gatherings were often facades where the powerful mingled, deals were struck, and secrets slipped through careless lips. She would attend as Miss Jane Marple, a retired spinster with a modest donation and an innocent curiosity, her sharp mind hidden behind a gentle smile. The evening arrived, and Burlington Hall glowed under chandeliers that cast golden light across polished marble floors. Miss Marple, dressed in a tasteful navy gown borrowed from her niece, blended effortlessly with the crowd. Her gray hair was neatly pinned, and her glasses perched low on her nose, giving her the air of a kindly aunt. She carried a small beaded clutch, its contents unremarkable save for a notebook where she jotted observations in her tidy shorthand. The hall buzzed with conversation lords and ladies, MPs, and financiers, their laughter mingling with the clink of champagne flutes. Sir Henry Walton stood near the stage, a tall man in his 50s with silver-flecked hair and a politician's practiced ease. His smile was broad, his handshake firm, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted toward the entrance as if expecting an unwelcome guest. Victor Crane was there too, impeccable in a tailored suit, his presence commanding yet understated. The two men exchanged a glance, brief but loaded like a spark in a powder keg. Miss Marple drifted through the crowd, her ears attuned to snippets of conversation. A dowager complained about rising taxes. A young heiress giggled over a scandalous rumor. Then, near a marble pillar, she overheard something that made her pause. A woman in a crimson dress, her voice low and urgent, murmured to a companion, "Henry's in over his head. If he talks, we're all done for." The companion, a balding man with a nervous tic, nodded and whispered, "The broker won't let him slip." The broker? The name sent a shiver through Miss Marple. It was the same shadowy figure Tom, the dockworker, had mentioned in Siberia. Puppet master pulling the syndicate strings. Could Sir Henry be the broker? Or was he merely another pawn? She maneuvered closer to Sir Henry, pausing to admire a floral arrangement on a nearby table. Among the roses and lilies was a single orchid, its purple petals unmistakable. Her heart quickened. The clue was here, as she'd suspected, woven into the evening's opulence. She caught Sir Henry's eye and offered a polite smile, extending her hand. "Miss Jane Marple," she said softly, "I so admire your work for the children's hospital." Sir Henry's smile was automatic, but his eyes lingered on her, searching for intent. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a cause close to my heart." His voice was smooth, but a bead of sweat glistened at his temple. "I couldn't help noticing the lovely orchid," she continued, her tone light, "a rare variety, isn't it? I saw one like it in Seabury, at a charming greenhouse." The mention of Seabury was deliberate, a pebble tossed into still water. Sir Henry's smile faltered just for a moment before he recovered. "Oh, yes, a gift from a supporter," he said, gesturing vaguely. "I'm no botanist, I'm afraid." But his fingers tightened around his glass, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a nerve dot as the evening progressed. A string quartet played, and Sir Henry took the stage to deliver a speech. His words were eloquent, promising hope and healing, but Miss Marple watched his hands, which gripped the podium too tightly. She slipped into the crowd, moving toward the cloakroom where guests had left their coats. The discarded note from the manor had been found in Sir Henry's pocket. Perhaps another clue awaited. The cloakroom attendant, a young woman with tired eyes, was distracted by a flurry of guests retrieving their wraps. Miss Marple, with the ease of someone who'd spent decades blending into the background, slipped behind the counter. She found Sir Henry's coat of fine wool overcoat with a silk lining and checked its pockets. Her fingers closed around a folded slip of paper. Heart pounding, she tucked it into her clutch and returned to the hall, her expression serene. Back at her table, she unfolded the note under the cover of her napkin. It read, "See plans to move the bonds tomorrow. Warehouse on Blackthorn Lane. Cut him off or we're finished." The handwriting matched the Manor's note, confirming Sir Henry's intent to betray Crane. Blackthorn Lane was a gritty corner of East London, far from the polished world of Burlington Hall. The bonds, she suspected, were the final delivery, mentioned in the lighthouse documents a fortune in stolen securities. That could fund the syndicate's expansion or destabilize markets if mishandled. Miss Marple's mind raced. Confronting Sir Henry directly was risky. He was cornered, desperate, and likely dangerous. But if she could fluster him, push him to act rashly, he might reveal more. She waited until the speech ended and the crowd applauded, then approached him again, this time near a quiet alcove. "Sir Henry," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I wonder if you might help me with a small matter. I've heard whispers of a rather troubling business in Seabury, something about orchids and shipments. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" His face paled, and for a moment, she thought he might bolt. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple," he stammered. "Seabury's a lovely town, but I've no dealings there." "Oh, of course," she said, her smile disarming. "Just an old woman's fancy. But it's curious how orchids keep appearing, don't you think, like a signature?" She let the word hang, watching his reaction. Sir Henry's eyes widened, and he excused himself abruptly, muttering about a meeting. Miss Marple watched him hurry toward Crane, their heads bent, in urgent conversation. She'd planted the seed. Now she needed to act before Sir Henry could warn the syndicate. The next morning, Miss Marple took a taxi to a quiet park in Kensington, a place she'd chosen for its seclusion. She'd sent a message to Sir Henry through a discreet contact, requesting a meeting. The note was vague but pointed. "I know about the orchids and the bonds. Meet me at Kensington Gardens by the Peter Pan statue, 10 a.m. Come alone." She'd signed it only with her initials, trusting his fear would draw him out. The park was serene, its paths lined with autumn leaves. Miss Marple sat on a bench, a book in her lap, her knitting needles clicking softly. Sir Henry arrived promptly, his face drawn, his usual polish replaced by a hunted look. He sat beside her, glancing nervously at passers-by. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but you're meddling in dangerous affairs." "I'm merely an old woman who notices things," she replied, her tone mild. "Like a rare orchid in a greenhouse or a note about bonds on Blackthorn Lane. You're planning to betray Victor Crane, aren't you? To save yourself." Sir Henry's breath caught, and he gripped the bench. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Crane's empire is bigger than you can imagine. It spans countries, governments. If I talk, I'm a dead man." "Then why write the note?" she pressed, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Why plan to expose him?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I'm trapped. Crane's reckless, he's drawing too much attention. The bonds are his final play, a fortune stolen from European banks. If he succeeds, he'll vanish, and I'll be left holding the bag. I want out." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but calculating. "Help me stop him. Sir Henry, tell me when and where the delivery will happen. The authorities can protect you." He laughed bitterly. "The authorities? Half of them are in Crane's pocket. But I have no choice. He scribbled an address and time on a scrap of paper and thrust it into her hand. Tomorrow night, 11 p.m., Blackthorn Lane. The warehouse is guarded, heavily. That's all I know. Now leave me be. She tucked the paper away, her heart steady despite the weight of his words. You've done the right thing, Sir Henry. But be careful. Desperate men make dangerous enemies. He stood, his face ashen, and walked away without another word. Miss Marple remained on the bench, her knitting untouched, her mind already turning to the next step. The warehouse on Blackthorn Lane was the syndicate's endgame, and she had less than 36 hours to prepare. Inspector Davies, her old ally from Scotland Yard, would need to be informed, but discreetly. Crane's reach was long, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited a small tea shop near the Strand, a place frequented by journalists and minor officials. She chose a table by the window, ordered a scone, and waited. A young reporter, Clara Henshaw, joined her, her notepad tucked under her arm. Clara was a friend of a friend, sharp and ambitious, with a knack for uncovering secrets. Miss Marple had enlisted her to dig into Sir Henry's public life, hoping to find a crack in his facade. Miss Marple, Clara said, sliding into the seat opposite, you were right to suspect Walton. He's been living beyond his means. Private clubs, a second home in France, donations to causes that don't add up. There's talk he's tied to some shady import business, but no one's pinned it down. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. And the orchids, any mention of those? Clara's eyes lit up. Funny you ask. I found a shipping manifest from a year ago, buried in a customs office file. It lists a crate of rare orchids delivered to a warehouse on Blackthorn Lane, addressed to a company linked to Walton. The company's a shell, of course, but it's a start. Well done, Clara, Miss Marple said, her voice warm but firm. Keep this quiet, my dear. The less attention, the better. As Clara left, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind piecing together the puzzle. The orchids, the bonds, the warehouse, all roads led to Blackthorn Lane. Sir Henry's confession had given her the when and where, but Crane's escape routes remained a mystery. She needed to anticipate his moves, to think like a man who'd built an empire on deception. The following evening, Miss Marple stood in the shadows of Blackthorn Lane, her scarf pulled tight against the chill. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its walls streaked with grime. She'd contacted Inspector Davies, who was assembling a team, but she'd insisted on scouting the site herself. An old woman with a sketchbook, pausing to draw the city's industrial charm, was unlikely to draw suspicion. She noted the guards too at the main entrance, one patrolling the perimeter. A van idled nearby, its driver smoking a cigarette. The air smelled of oil and damp concrete. But there, faint but unmistakable, was the scent of orchids. She followed it to a side alley where a crate lay discarded, its lid pried open. Inside were wilted orchid petals, their purple hue faded, but distinct. The syndicate's signature. Even here, her heart raced, but her hands were steady as she jotted notes in her sketchbook. Guard positions, entry points, the VIN's license plate. She'd passed this to Davies, ensuring the sting was precise. Sir Henry's betrayal had given her the leverage, but the orchid clue had guided her every step. It was a small thing, a fragile flower, but it had unraveled a web of greed and power. As she slipped away, the city's lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the stakes. Tomorrow night, the warehouse would be a battlefield, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, would ensure Crane's empire faced its reckoning. Chapter 11. The trap is set. Morning mist clung to the streets of London like a conspirator, softening the edges of the city's sprawl and muffling its usual clamor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her modest hotel room near King's Cross, her hands folded neatly over a cup of cooling tea, her mind a whirl of calculations. The slip of paper from Sir Henry Walton lay on the table before her, its scrawled details searing in her memory. Blackthorn Lane, warehouse, 11 p.m. tomorrow. The politician's confession in Kensington Gardens had been a turning point, a crack in the facade of Victor Crane's smuggling empire. Now, with the final delivery of stolen bonds looming, Miss Marple faced the delicate task of orchestrating a trap without alerting Crane's vast network of spies and loyalists. She adjusted her glasses and glanced at the clock. Barely past 7. Time was her ally, but only if she wielded it with precision. Sir Henry's fear had made him pliable, but fear could also make him reckless. His admission that Crane's empire spanned countries, with tendrils in governments and banks, had confirmed her suspicions. This was no mere smuggling ring. The bonds, stolen from European vaults, were a linchpin, a fortune that could either solidify Crane's power or unravel it entirely. Miss Marple's plan hinged on turning Sir Henry into an informant, but she needed to ensure his cooperation without exposing herself for him to Crane's wrath. Her first task was to contact Inspector Davies, her trusted ally at Scotland Yard. Davies was a rare breed, an honest policeman with a sharp mind and a healthy distrust of the powerful. She'd worked with him before, in quieter cases back in St. Mary Mead, but this was a beast of a different scale. She penned a brief, coded note on hotel stationery, disguising her intent as a request for advice on a charity matter. The note read, "Dear Inspector, I seek your counsel on a donation to a children's fund, to be delivered tomorrow at 11 p.m. on Blackthorn Lane. Discretion is paramount, as the gift is substantial and attracts unsavory attention. Yours, J.M." She sealed it in an envelope and entrusted it to a bellboy, with instructions to deliver it directly to Scotland Yard. With the note dispatched, Miss Marple turned her attention to Sir Henry. His betrayal of Crane was a double-edged sword. He could be her key to the warehouse, but a frightened man was unpredictable. She needed to keep him tethered to ensure he didn't bolt or, worse, warn Crane. She decided on a subtle approach. A second meeting, this time on neutral ground. To reinforce his commitment, she chose a small bookshop in Bloomsbury, a place she knew from past visits, its shelves stuffed with dusty tomes and its owner blissfully incurious. She sent another message to Sir Henry, this time through a street vendor she befriended near the hotel. "Meet me at Quill and Ink, 2 p.m. We must discuss the children's fund." J.M. The reference to the fund was a nod to their earlier conversation, a signal he'd understand. The bookshop smelled of old leather and ink, its narrow aisles a labyrinth of forgotten stories. Miss Marple arrived early, her gray coat blending with the shop's muted tones. She browsed a shelf of Victorian novels, her fingers tracing the spines while her eyes flicked toward the door. Sir Henry entered at precisely 2, his face pale, beneath his trilby hat, his eyes scanning the room like a hunted animal. He spotted her and approached, his steps hesitant. "Miss Marple," he whispered, his voice tight. "This is madness. If Crane finds out I'm here, then we must be quick," she interrupted, her tone calm but firm. She held up a copy of Bleak House, as if discussing its merits. "You've given me the time and place, Sir Henry. That was brave. But I need more. Who guards the warehouse? What are Crane's plans if the delivery fails?" He swallowed hard, glancing at the shop's lone clerk, who was engrossed in a ledger. "You don't understand what he's capable of. The guard's 6, maybe 7, all armed, ex-soldiers, loyal to Crane's money If the delivery fails, he's got a ship waiting at Tilbury docks. He'll vanish, probably to South America. He's done it before. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. And the bonds? Where are they coming from? Sir Henry hesitated, then leaned closer, his breath sour with nerves. A bank in Zurich. Crane's men hid it months ago. Silent job. No trace. The bonds are untraceable, worth millions. He's selling them to a buyer from Shanghai, someone with no questions and deep pockets. Her heart quickened, but her face remained placid. Thank you, Sir Henry. You've done the right thing. The authorities will handle the rest, and you'll be protected. But you must stay silent. One word to Crane, and your chance at freedom is gone. He nodded, his hands trembling. I won't talk. But you don't know him, Miss Marple. He sees everything. She smiled faintly, closing the book. Then we'll simply have to be invisible, as Sir Henry left. Miss Marple lingered, purchasing the copy of Bleak House as a keepsake. His information was gold, but it came with a shadow: Crane's escape. Plan: Tilbury Docks was a maze of wharves and warehouses, a smuggler's paradise. If the sting at Blackthorn Lane failed, Crane could slip away, leaving his empire intact. She needed a backup plan, a way to track him if he fled. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited a telegraph office, sending a message to Clara Henshaw, the young reporter who'd uncovered the orchid shipment. Clara's knack for digging through records could prove vital. The telegram was brief: need details on ships departing Tilbury Docks tomorrow night. Urgent. J.M. She trusted Clara's discretion and her hunger for a story, though she'd warned her to keep this one quiet until the dust settled. Next, she met Inspector Davies at a nondescript pub near Scotland Yard. The rusty anchor was a favorite of off-duty officers, its noise a perfect cover for sensitive conversations. Davies, a burly man with a graying mustache, greeted her with a nod, his eyes sharp despite the pint in his hand. Miss Marple, he said, keeping his voice low. Your note was cryptic, but I know you don't waste words. What's this about? Blackthorn Lane. She sipped her lemonade, her demeanor as unassuming as ever. A smuggling operation, Inspector. Stolen bonds, millions in value, set to change hands tomorrow at 11 p.m. The ringleader is Victor Crane, a businessman with a long reach. I've an informant who's given me the details, but we must move carefully. Crane has eyes everywhere. Davies raised an eyebrow. Crane. He's a ghost in London's underworld. No one's pinned anything on him. You sure about this? As sure as I am of my knitting, she replied, a twinkle in her eye. But there's more. If the sting fails, Crane plans to flee via a ship at Tilbury Docks. We need men there, discreetly, in case he slips through. Davies scratched his chin, his mind already turning. I can muster a team small, trusted. No uniforms, plainclothes only. But we'll need more than your word to justify the operation. Evidence, Miss Marple. She reached into her clutch and slid a folded paper across the table, the note from Sir Henry's coat, detailing the warehouse and bonds. This should suffice for now. My informant will testify, under protection. And there's a crate at Blackthorn Lane with orchid petals, a mark of Crane's operation. You'll find it in the alley. Davies pocketed the note, his expression grim. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Marple. If Crane's as connected as you say, this could stir up a hornet's nest. Then we'll need a steady hand to swat them, she said, her voice steady. I'll be at the warehouse, Inspector, as a buyer, to draw them out. Crane's men won't suspect an old woman. Davies nearly choked on his pint. Yo, at a sting? Miss Marple, with all due respect, respect is noted, Inspector, she interrupted. her tone gentle but unyielding. But I've seen this through from Seabury's greenhouse to London's shadows. I know their signals, their habits. I'll be there, and I'll be careful. He sighed, knowing better than to argue. Fine. But you stay on the edges, and you signal if anything goes wrong. We'll have men in place by 10:30. They parted with a handshake, and Miss Marple returned to her hotel, her mind buzzing with details. The sting was set, but Crane's cunning required one final precaution. She needed an edge, something to unsettle him, to make him doubt his own web. The next evening, as dusk settled over London, Miss Marple prepared for the warehouse. She chose a simple black dress, its somber hue suited to a buyer with discreet wealth. Her scarf, embroidered with tiny orchids, a deliberate nod to Crane's signature, added a touch of irony. She tucked a small whistle into her sleeve, a signal for Davies if things went awry, and carried a leather satchel, ostensibly for the bonds but empty save for her notebook and a pen. Before heading to Blackthorn Lane, she made one last stop, a florist's shop near Covent Garden. The shop was closing, its owner sweeping the floor, but Miss Marple's charm secured a single item, a rare purple orchid, identical to those woven through Crane's empire. She pinned it to her scarf, a silent challenge to Crane's confidence. If he saw it, he might hesitate, wondering how an old woman knew his code. The taxi dropped her a block from Blackthorn Lane, and she walked the rest, her steps slow but purposeful. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the sodium glow of streetlights. She spotted Davies' men plainclothes officers posing as dockworkers, their movements casual but their eyes alert. The van from her earlier scouting was there, its driver now joined by two others, all smoking and watching the street. Miss Marple approached the alley, her satchel clutched tightly. The crate of wilted orchids was still there, its scent faint, but unmistakable. She lingered, sketching the warehouse in her notebook, her pencil strokes a cover for her observations. The guards were as Sir Henry described, 6, heavily built, their coats bulging with concealed weapons. One carried a radio, its static crackling in a quiet dot. At 10:45, a sleek car pulled up, and Victor Crane stepped out, his presence commanding even in the dim light. His eyes swept the area, missing nothing. Miss Marple felt a chill but kept her head down, her sketchbook shielding her face. Crane entered the warehouse, followed by two guards, while the others fanned out, securing the perimeter. She moved closer, her heart steady despite the danger. At the warehouse door, she knocked softly, her voice taking on a quaver she didn't feel. "Excuse me, I'm here for the acquisition. Mr. Crane is expecting me." The guard, a hulking man with a scar across his cheek, squinted at her. "Name, Miss Primrose," she lied, choosing a name as unthreatening as her appearance. "I represent a private buyer from Shanghai." He hesitated, then spoke into his radio. After a moment, he nodded and opened the door. Inside, no funny business. The warehouse was cavernous, its air thick with the smell of oil and damp wood. Crates were stacked high, some marked with the orchid symbol she'd come to know. Crane stood near a table, a briefcase open before him, its contents glinting bonds, neatly bundled, their edges catching the light. He looked up as she entered, his smile cold but curious. "Miss Primrose," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "A pleasure. I wasn't expecting someone of your distinction." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Oh, I'm just a go-between, Mr. Crane. My employer values discretion and quality." She let her gaze linger on the bonds, then flicked to the orchid on her scarf. "I see you appreciate fine things, too." Crane's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing at the orchid. "An interesting choice," he said, his tone guarded. Where did you come by it? A gift. She replied, her voice light, from a friend in Seabury. You know the place, I'm sure. The mention of Seabury hit like a dart. Crane's hand twitched, and one of his guards stepped closer, sensing tension. Miss Marple kept her composure, her fingers brushing the whistle in her sleeve. She needed to keep him talking, to delay until Davy's men were in position. Your bonds are impressive, she continued, stepping toward the table. But I wonder about their provenance. My employer is particular about such things. Crane's laugh was sharp, devoid of humor. They're clean, Miss Primrose. Cleaner than most in this city. Shall we discuss terms? Before she could answer, a shout came from outside a guard, alarmed. Davy's men were moving in. Crane's eyes darkened, and he snapped the briefcase shut. We're done here, he barked, signaling his men. Miss Marple blew the whistle, its shrill note cutting through the warehouse. Chaos erupted, shouts, footsteps. The crash of a crate. She ducked behind a stack, her heart pounding but her mind clear. Crane bolted for a side door, his guards covering him. She caught a glimpse of the orchid symbol on the briefcase as he fled, a final confirmation of his guilt. Davy's team stormed in, their shouts mingling with the guards' curses. Miss Marple stayed low, her satchel clutched tight, until a familiar voice called her name. Miss Marple. You all right? It was Davies, his face flushed but relieved. I'm quite well, Inspector, she said, emerging from her hiding spot. But Crane's headed for Tilbury Docks. You'll need to move quickly. Davies nodded, barking orders into his radio. The warehouse was secured, the bonds seized, and most of Crane's men detained. But Crane himself had slipped through, as she'd feared. The orchid on her scarf felt heavy now, a reminder that the game wasn't over. As she left the warehouse, the night air cool against her skin, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Sir Henry's gambit had paid off, the sting had worked, but Crane's escape meant the final act was yet to come. She'd follow the orchid's trail to Tilbury, to the docks where Crane thought he could vanish. One small clue, one fragile flower, had brought her this far. It would lead her to the end.